Hello there, fellow seekers of the unknown. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Wherever you might be in this vast world of ours, take a moment to ground yourself. What time is it where you are? Are you listening from the bustling streets of a city or perhaps the quiet countryside? Whatever corner of the earth you call home, you found your way here to Sleep Theories, and for that, I'm grateful. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. Either way, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between fact and fiction, between what we know and what we fear to discover. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you about Kieran Olwyn and his descent into a conspiracy that runs deeper than the Caribbean Sea itself. The fluorescent lights in the Trinidad archives hummed with the persistence of insects trapped in amber. Kieran Olwyn pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and surveyed the chaos before him. Decades of petroleum records, contracts and correspondence scattered across metal shelving like the remnants of a bureaucratic explosion. The smell of old paper and industrial disinfectant hung heavy in the windowless basement, a fitting tomb for Trinidad and Tobago's energy secrets. At 34, Kieran had spent the better part of a decade following money trails through the labyrinthine world of forensic accounting. Shell companies, phantom subsidiaries, and creative bookkeeping were his daily bread. But this assignment felt different. The government had hired his firm to conduct a routine audit of the defunct State Energy Archive, officially to reconcile missing oil revenue from the early 1990s. Unofficially, everyone knew it was damage control after yet another corruption scandal had erupted in Parliament. Kieran's methodical nature served him well in work like this. While his colleagues might have been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of documents, he found comfort in the systematic approach. Categorize, digitize, cross-reference, repeat. It was Wednesday afternoon when he discovered the anomaly. Tucked between two binders of pipeline maintenance reports, he found a slim external hard drive, its black casing dusty but undamaged. A yellowed label read, July 1990 eyes only, in neat block letters. The date made Kieran pause. July 1990, the month of the coup attempt. Most Trinidadians of his generation knew the basic facts. On July 27, 1990, members of the Jamaat al-Muslimin had stormed the Red House, taking hostages including the Prime Minister. This siege lasted 6 days, leaving Port of Spain in chaos and dozens dead. The official narrative painted it as an isolated act of religious extremism, quickly contained by security forces and international intervention. But Kieran had always found certain aspects of the official story curious. How had a relatively small group managed to penetrate government security so effectively? Why had the military response been so delayed? And most puzzling of all, why had the perpetrators been granted amnesty and released, only to see many of them die under mysterious circumstances in the years that followed? He connected the hard drive to his laptop, half expecting it to be corrupted or password protected. To his surprise, it opened immediately, revealing a folder structure that made his pulse quicken. The drive contained email correspondence, financial records, and what appeared to be operational documents, all dated in the weeks leading up to the coup. The first email thread was between someone identified only as Holloway, with a State Department email signature and M. Charles, using a local government domain. The subject line read, Energy Sector Realignment, Timeline Confirmation. Kieran opened the first message, dated July 3rd, 1990. Michael, everything proceeds according to schedule. The domestic situation should provide adequate cover for the structural adjustments we discussed. Phase 1 implementation targeted for August 1st. Recommend accelerating the subsidiary formations we outlined in Panama. The window may be narrower than initially projected. Arch. The response, dated July 5th. Richard, understood. Local assets are in position. The Orinoco Trust documentation is ready for activation post-disruption. One concern, the PM's energy advisor, Dandridge, has been asking uncomfortable questions about the Blackwater concessions, may need managing -MC. Kieran felt his mouth go dry. He'd heard of Esma Dandridge. She'd been a prominent figure in energy policy during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Though she'd abruptly retired from public service shortly after the coup, the Orinoco Trust was unfamiliar, but something about Blackwater concessions triggered a vague memory. He scrolled through more emails, each one adding another piece to an increasingly disturbing puzzle. References to Operation Thermocline, mentions of US naval intelligence assets, and most chilling of all, a message dated July 25th, just 2 days before the coup, that simply read, "Thermocline is greenlit. Collapse required for reallocation. All units standing by. Remember, controlled chaos, maximum 3 days. Minimal permanent damage to infrastructure. The oil keeps flowing." Command authority? Kieran leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If these documents were authentic, and his trained eye saw no obvious signs of forgery, they suggested something that contradicted everything he'd been taught about July 1990. The coup hadn't been an isolated act of extremism. It had been anticipated, possibly even orchestrated, by foreign interests seeking to restructure Trinidad's energy sector. He spent the rest of the afternoon printing and copying the files, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. As the sun set over Port of Spain, casting long shadows through the archive's single basement window, Kieran realised he was holding evidence of what might be the most significant conspiracy in Caribbean history. But evidence of what exactly? And more importantly, who could he trust with information this explosive? As he prepared to leave that evening, carefully securing the hard drive in his briefcase, Kieran noticed something that made his blood run cold. The building's security log showed his keycard being used to enter the archive at 9:47 a.m. that morning. But he distinctly remembered arriving at 10:15 a.m. Someone else had been in the archive that morning, someone with access to his credentials, someone who might know exactly what he'd just discovered. Kieran barely slept that night. Every car that passed his modest St. Augustine apartment seemed to slow down. Every creak of the building's aging frame sounded like footsteps in the hallway. By dawn, he'd made a decision. He would continue his investigation, but carefully, methodically, using all the skills that had made him one of Port of Spain's most sought-after forensic accountants. The next morning he arrived at the archive early, determined to appear as if nothing had changed while secretly continuing his investigation. He'd hidden copies of the hard drive contents in 3 separate locations: his apartment, a safety deposit box, and with his sister in San Fernando, and had begun the painstaking process of cross-referencing the names and entities mentioned in the emails. It was while tracing the Orinoco Trust that Kieran stumbled upon his next major discovery. Buried in a box of seemingly routine Petroleum Ministry correspondence from 1991, he found a leather-bound ledger that had somehow escaped digitization. The cover was embossed with the logo of a financial services firm he didn't recognize. Meridian Advisory, Grand Cayman. The ledger's pages were filled with meticulous handwritten entries, tracking financial flows between various entities over a period spanning from August 1990 through December 1992. What immediately caught Kieran's attention was the systematic nature of the transfers, millions of US dollars flowing through a complex web of shell companies, trust funds and offshore accounts. At the centre of it all was the Orinoco Trust, exactly as mentioned in the emails from the hard drive. But the ledger revealed the trust's true scope. It wasn't just a single entity. It was the hub of a vast financial network that included subsidiaries across the Caribbean, Central America, and what appeared to be several African nations. One subsidiary name made Kieran's pulse quicken: Blackstone Wave Holdings. He'd seen that name before, not in the Petroleum Ministry files, but in his previous work investigating international money laundering schemes. Blackstone Wave had appeared in declassified CIA documents related to Operation PB Success, the 1954 Guatemalan coup, and had been linked to several other covert operations throughout the Cold War era. But most intriguing of all was a series of entries that referenced something called Magdalena Depths, with the notation TT/4B. The amounts associated with this designation were substantial, over $50 million between 1990 and 1992, but there was no indication of what goods or services this represented. A handwritten note in the margin, in what appeared to be a different person's handwriting, provided a tantalizing clue. Deep sight operational, signals clear, Recommend expansion phase 2 pending political stability. Kieran photographed every page of the ledger, his excitement growing with each revelation. The financial flows clearly showed that massive amounts of oil revenue, money that should have remained in Trinidad's national treasury, had been systematically diverted through this network of foreign-controlled entities. But the more he studied the patterns, the more questions arose. Why had these diversions accelerated immediately after the coup? What was Magdalena Depths, and why was it worth $50 million to mysterious foreign interests? And most puzzling of all, why had someone been so careless as to leave this evidence in a basement archive where any competent auditor might eventually find it? Unless, Kieran realised with growing unease, they hadn't been careless at all. Unless this was exactly where they'd intended the ledger to be found, by exactly the right person, at exactly the right time. As if summoned by his paranoid thoughts, Kieran heard footsteps in the corridor outside the archive. Slow, measured footsteps that stopped directly outside the door. He quickly closed the ledger and slipped it under a stack of routine reports, his heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps resumed, moving away down the corridor. But not before Kieran caught sight of a shadow under the door. Someone had been standing there, listening, for at least 30 seconds. He was no longer alone in his investigation. Someone was watching. That evening, Kieran made the decision that would change everything. Rather than retreat into caution, he would push forward, following the evidence wherever it led. His first stop would be Esme Dandridge, the former energy advisor whose name had appeared in the coup-era emails. Finding Dandridge proved easier than expected. She was listed in the phone directory, living in a modest house in Diego Martin. When Kieran called, she agreed to meet him the following afternoon, though her voice carried a weariness that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation for a long time. Esme Dandridge was a woman in her early 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her home was filled with books, old photographs, and the accumulated wisdom of a career spent navigating the treacherous waters of Caribbean energy politics. She served Kieran tea in delicate china cups while he explained his discovery of the archive materials. "I wondered when someone would finally start asking the right questions," she said when he finished his account. "I've been waiting 34 years for this conversation." Esme's story began in 1989, when she was serving as the Ministry of Energy's chief policy advisor. Even then, she explained, there had been growing pressure from foreign interests to restructure Trinidad's energy sector, opening it up to private investment and reducing government control over oil and gas resources. The Americans were very persuasive, she recalled, her voice carrying a hint of old bitterness. They spoke of modernization, efficiency, increased revenues. What they didn't mention was that most of those increased revenues would flow to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Panama. The pressure had intensified throughout 1989 and early 1990, with a series of high-level meetings involving US energy consultants, World Bank representatives and local politicians. Esme had been suspicious of the speed with which these reforms were being pushed through, particularly since many of the proposed contracts seemed to have been written in Washington, before they ever reached Port of Spain. "I remember one meeting in particular," she continued, setting down her teacup with a soft clink. "It was May 1990, just 2 months before the coup. I was escorted by US personnel to what they called an energy security briefing at the old Chaguaramas naval facility." Kieran frowned. "But wasn't that base decommissioned after independence?" "Officially, yes. But there were always rumours that certain sections remained operational for mutual defence purposes. That day, I was taken to a bunker complex I'd never seen before, deep underground. The briefing was conducted by men who introduced themselves only by first names, and the presentation materials bore the seal of the Defence Intelligence Agency. The briefing, Esme recalled, had focused on something called the Magdalena Deep Water Project. The Americans claimed to have identified substantial underwater oil and gas reserves in Trinidad's territorial waters, but accessing them would require advanced deep-sea drilling technology that only US companies possessed. They showed me sonar maps, geological surveys, projected extraction volumes, all very impressive. But when I asked to see the raw data, they became evasive, and when I suggested that any such project should be managed jointly with the National Oil Company, they made it clear that wasn't an option. The contracts they'd presented would have essentially leased Trinidad's deepwater drilling rights to a consortium of US companies for 99 years, with the government receiving only a minimal royalty percentage. When Esme refused to endorse the arrangement, the pressure had intensified dramatically. In June 1990, I started receiving phone calls at home. Nothing overtly threatening, but the message was clear. Cooperate or face consequences. My daughter was studying in London at the time, and someone sent her photographs of herself walking to class with no note or explanation. The implications were obvious. Then came July 27th, 1990, and everything changed. During the 6 days of the coup, while Port of Spain burned and the government was held hostage, a series of emergency decrees were quietly signed, including one that authorised the immediate implementation of critical energy infrastructure projects for national security purposes. By the time order was restored, the Magdalena contracts had already been activated, Esme said, her voice barely above a whisper. The oil was never ours, Kieran. It was leased, like we were. But that wasn't the end of Esme's story. In the months following the coup, she'd continued to investigate the Magdalena project, using her remaining contacts in the ministry to gather information. What she'd discovered had terrified her into early retirement. The deepwater drilling wasn't just about oil extraction, she explained. The facility they built out there, it wasn't just a platform. It was a permanent installation with capabilities far beyond anything needed for petroleum production. Sonar arrays, communications equipment, what looked like weapons systems, and all of it operated by personnel who definitely weren't oil workers. Esme had compiled a dossier of her findings, documenting the true nature of the Magdalena project and its connections to the coup, but she'd never felt safe enough to publish it. Too many people who'd asked questions about July 1990 had met unfortunate ends. Car accidents, heart attacks, mysterious disappearances. I can show you the documents, she offered, rising from her chair. But Kieran, you need to understand what you're getting into. These people don't just steal oil revenues, they eliminate threats. As Esme disappeared into her study to retrieve the dossier, Kieran gazed out her living room window at the peaceful Diego Martin neighbourhood. Children played in yards, neighbours chatted over fences, life continued with mundane normalcy. But beneath this surface tranquility, he was beginning to glimpse something vast and dark, a shadow conspiracy that had shaped Caribbean history for decades. When Esme returned with a thick manila folder, her expression was grave. One more thing, Kieran. Since you started this investigation, have you noticed anyone following you? Any unusual phone calls, visits, encounters? Kieran thought of the shadow under the archive door, the feeling of being watched, the keycard entry that predated his arrival. Yes, he admitted. I think so. Esme nodded grimly. Then it's already begun. From this point forward, your life is in danger. The question is, are you prepared to see this through to the end? As Kieran accepted the heavy folder, he realised there was no turning back. Whatever the cost, he would follow this conspiracy to its source, even if it led him into the deepest, darkest waters of the Caribbean Sea. The men in the white Nissan first appeared on Thursday morning. Kieran noticed them parked across from his apartment building as he left for work. 2 figures in dark clothing with faces obscured by shadows and sunglasses. The car followed him at a discreet distance as he drove to the archive, maintaining careful separation but never disappearing entirely from his rearview mirror. By Friday, they'd been replaced by a different vehicle, a dark blue Toyota with government plates. The watchers were no longer hiding their presence. They were making a statement. Kieran was marked, tracked, and they wanted him to know it. Rather than intimidating him, the obvious surveillance only strengthened his resolve. If they were this concerned about his investigation, he must be onto something significant. That evening, after carefully confirming he wasn't being followed, Kieran drove to an address he'd found in Esme's dossier. The former estate of Sir Malcolm Hearn, a colonial-era judge and prominent Freemason who died in mysterious circumstances in 1993. The Hearn estate sat on several acres of overgrown land in the Maraval Hills, accessible only by a winding dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The main house was a crumbling colonial mansion, its windows boarded and roof partially collapsed. But the lodge building mentioned in Esme's notes appeared to be in better condition. Kieran parked his car behind a screen of bamboo and approached the lodge on foot, using his phone's flashlight to navigate the path through dense vegetation. The building was smaller than the main house, but constructed of solid stone, with mason symbols carved into the lintel above the entrance. The door was secured with a modern padlock, but the old windows had been left unprotected. Breaking and entering wasn't typically part of forensic accounting, but Kieran had long since moved beyond routine professional practice. He found a loose window and carefully climbed inside, finding himself in what had once been an elegant meeting room. Dust-covered chairs surrounded a circular table, and faded portraits of colonial officials lined the walls. But it was the basement that held the real secrets. Kieran found a hidden staircase concealed behind a bookshelf, leading down into a stone chamber that felt older than the lodge itself. The air was thick and musty, carrying scents of candle wax and something else, something organic and unsettling. His flashlight beam revealed walls covered in carved symbols that definitely weren't Masonic. Some resembled ancient Sumerian cuneiform, while others looked like variations of Caribbean indigenous petroglyphs. But dominating the far wall was a large relief carving that made Kieran's blood run cold, a ring of flame surrounding a broken crown with tentacle-like appendages reaching outward from the centre. Below this central symbol, someone had carved a series of dates: 1797, 1845, 1890, 1938, 1962, 1990. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious, but several of the dates corresponded to significant political upheavals in Trinidad's history. 1797 was the British conquest of the island, 1962 was independence, and 1990. A stone altar stood in the centre of the chamber, its surface stained with what could have been wine or something far more sinister. Melted candle wax covered every surface, and the remains of burned papers littered the floor. But what captured Kieran's attention was a series of framed photographs, arranged around the altar like offerings. The photographs showed groups of men in ceremonial robes, their faces clearly visible despite the ritualistic setting. Kieran recognised several faces immediately: former prime ministers, oil company executives, senior civil servants, and foreign diplomats. Some photos were recent, others dated back decades, but all showed the same pattern: powerful men gathered around altars similar to this one, under the light of a full moon. One photograph, apparently taken in 1990 based on the date stamp, showed a familiar face among the robed figures: the US energy consultant whose emails Kieran had found in the archive. Another face belonged to a man Kieran recognised as a former CIA station chief who'd been based in Port of Spain during the 1980s. But most disturbing of all was a photograph that appeared to have been taken in this very chamber, showing a group of robed figures conducting some kind of ceremony around a bound figure on the altar. The victim's face was turned away from the camera, but the date stamp showed July 30th, 1990, just 3 days after the coup began. Kieran photographed everything, his hands shaking as he documented evidence of what appeared to be a secret society that had been manipulating Caribbean politics for over 2 centuries. The ritual chamber suggested connections that went far beyond simple economic exploitation. This was something deeper, older, and infinitely more dangerous. As he prepared to leave, Kieran noticed something carved into the altar itself, almost hidden by the accumulation of wax and stains. Working carefully with his car keys, he cleared away enough residue to reveal a short inscription in what appeared to be Latin: Dominion via sacrifice, renewed every generation. Below that, in more recent carving, someone had added "The flame burns eternal, Operation Thermocline complete." Kieran was so absorbed in documenting the inscription that he almost missed the sound of car engines outside. But as he raised his head, he could hear vehicles approaching the estate, multiple vehicles, moving slowly but deliberately up the access road. His blood turned to ice as he realised his mistake. The surveillance hadn't been meant to intimidate him, it had been meant to track him, to follow him to exactly this location. And now he was trapped in an underground chamber with only one exit, while unknown numbers of people approached the lodge above. Moving as quietly as possible, Kieran climbed the stone stairs back to the main floor of the lodge. Through a gap in the boarded windows, he could see flashlight beams moving through the overgrown grounds. At least 6 men, possibly more, spread out in a professional search pattern. These weren't local police or security guards. Their movements were too coordinated, too military in precision. And as one of them passed close to the window, Kieran glimpsed something that made his heart stop. The man was wearing a medallion around his neck, bearing the same symbol he'd seen carved on the altar below, a ring of flame around a broken crown. The Watchers weren't just government agents or corporate security. They were members of the same secret society whose ritual chamber he'd just discovered, and they were closing in on him with the methodical precision of hunters who'd done this many times before. Kieran realised he had perhaps minutes before they reached the lodge and discovered his entry point. But escape seemed impossible. They had the building surrounded, and his car was parked in plain sight behind the bamboo screen. Unless he could find another way out, a way that didn't involve the main entrance or the windows they were undoubtedly watching. As footsteps approached the lodge's front door, Kieran descended back into the ritual chamber, desperately hoping that a facility this secretive might have been built with more than one exit. His flashlight beams swept the stone walls, searching for any indication of a hidden passage or escape route. And there, behind the altar itself, he found what he was looking for. A narrow opening in the wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The passage led downward into darkness, disappearing into the bedrock beneath the estate. As the sound of splintering wood echoed from above, the Watchers had broken down the lodge's front door. Kieran plunged into the narrow tunnel, following it deeper underground, away from the ritual chamber and the men who'd come to silence him forever. He had no idea where the passage led, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He'd stumbled onto something far more dangerous than oil revenue fraud. He'd discovered evidence of a conspiracy that had been operating in the shadows for generations, manipulating Caribbean politics through a combination of economic pressure and occult ritual. And now they knew he knew. The underground passage led Kieran through nearly a mile of natural caves and man-made tunnels, before finally emerging through a concealed opening in a hillside overlooking the Gulf of Paria. By the time he reached the surface, dawn was breaking over the Caribbean, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed to mock the darkness he'd just escaped. His car was undoubtedly compromised, his apartment was being watched, and returning to the archive was out of the question. But rather than driving him to despair, the night's revelations had crystallized his purpose. He would follow the conspiracy to its source, no matter the personal cost. Using cash and careful tradecraft learned from years of investigating white-collar criminals, Kieran made his way to Mayaro, a fishing village on Trinidad's southeastern coast. Esme's dossier had referenced this location as one of the observation points used to monitor the Magdalena Deepwater project, and local fishermen had reportedly witnessed unusual activity in the offshore waters. The village of Mayaro retained the unhurried pace of rural coastal life, but Kieran quickly sensed an undercurrent of unease among the residents. Conversation stopped when he approached, and several people turned away when he tried to ask questions about offshore activities. It was as if the entire community was living under some kind of shadow. He finally found someone willing to talk at a beachside rum shop, an elderly fisherman named Nolan Bastow, who'd been working these waters for over 40 years. After several drinks and careful conversation, Nolan admitted that he'd witnessed strange phenomena in the offshore waters since the early 1990s. Some nights the water itself seems to hum, Nolan explained, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass of rum. And there are lights down below, moving in patterns that don't make sense for any kind of sea life. Most of us learn to avoid that area, especially during the dark moon. Nolan described nights when the ocean would glow with phosphorescent light, forming geometric patterns that stretched for miles beneath the surface. Military vessels would occasionally appear to monitor these events, but they would warn off any fishing boats that came too close. Over the years, several fishermen who'd tried to investigate the phenomena had simply disappeared, their boats found empty and drifting days later. But the strangest thing, Nolan continued, lowering his voice, is the sound. When the lights appear, you can hear something like singing coming from underwater. Not human singing, something else. Something that makes your teeth ache and your dreams turn dark. Kieran felt the familiar chill of recognition. The ritual chamber, the secret society, and now reports of otherworldly phenomena in the exact location of the Magdalena project. The conspiracy was revealing dimensions that extended far beyond economic exploitation or political manipulation. After considerable negotiation and a substantial cash payment, Nolan agreed to take Kieran out to the area where these phenomena had been observed. They left before dawn in Nolan's aging fishing boat, heading southeast into waters that most local fishermen had learned to avoid. The journey took nearly 3 hours, carrying them well beyond Trinidad's coastal shelf into the deep waters of the Atlantic. As they travelled, Nolan pointed out various markers, a peculiar current that ran counter to the prevailing flow, areas where fish were unusually scarce, and finally a cluster of unmarked buoys that appeared on no official navigation charts. "That's the boundary," Nolan explained, pointing to the buoys. "Past that point the water belongs to someone else." As they approached the buoy line, Kieran could see that each float bore sophisticated electronic equipment, cameras, sensors, and what appeared to be acoustic monitoring devices. But one buoy was different from the others, larger and more complex, with a faded designation painted on its side. USNS Marlin, Noentry, AUTAJORIZEDPERCONNELVONLY. USNS Marlin, Kieran muttered, photographing the buoy with his phone. The designation suggested a US Navy vessel, but there was no ship visible anywhere on the horizon. Nolan cut the engine, and they drifted closer to the Marlin buoy, close enough for Kieran to see that cables ran from its base down into the depths below. Using a simple depth finder, they determined that the water here was over 3,000 feet deep. Far too deep for conventional diving, but perfect for concealing large underwater installations. "Look at this," Nolan said, pointing to his fish finder display. The sonar was showing a massive structure on the ocean floor directly below them, something with geometric regularity that couldn't possibly be natural. The structure appeared to be at least 500 feet long and showed multiple levels, like a submerged building or facility. But most disturbing of all were the lights. Even in daylight they could see a faint glow emanating from the structure below, pulsing in regular intervals like a technological heartbeat. The pulses were accompanied by low-frequency sounds that seemed to resonate through the boat's hull, creating an almost subsonic thrumming that Kieran could feel in his bones. "This is what we came here to see," Nolan said grimly. "But we shouldn't stay long. The watchers will know we're here." As if summoned by his words, a fast patrol boat appeared on the horizon, approaching their position at high speed. Even at a distance, Kieran could see armed figures on its deck, and the vessel bore no national markings or identification numbers. Nolan immediately started the engine and turned back towards shore, but the patrol boat was faster and clearly determined to intercept them. Within minutes, it had closed to within a few hundred yards, and Kieran could hear amplified voices ordering them to stop and prepare for boarding. "Hold on," Nolan shouted, pushing his ancient engine to its limits. "I know these waters better than they do." What followed was a harrowing chase through the offshore waters, with Nolan using his decades of local knowledge to navigate shallow reefs and hidden channels that the larger patrol boat couldn't follow. They finally lost their pursuers in the maze of mangrove channels near the River swamp, but not before Kieran had gotten a clear look at their would-be captors. The men on the patrol boat weren't wearing military uniforms or police insignia. They were dressed in dark civilian clothing, and several bore the same medallions Kieran had seen at the Hearn estate, rings of flame around broken crowns. The secret society wasn't just manipulating politics and economics, they were operating their own private navy in Caribbean waters. As they made their way back to Mayaro through the coastal shallows, Kieran processed what he'd discovered. The Magdalena project wasn't just about oil extraction, it was about something far more significant. The underwater facility, the acoustic monitoring equipment, the reports of otherworldly phenomena, all pointed to a purpose that transcended conventional resource exploitation. But what exactly was hidden in the depths below? And why was it worth maintaining such an elaborate conspiracy to protect? The answers, Kieran realised, lay in the final piece of evidence he'd yet to fully investigate. The mysterious source known as Lucia 26, mentioned in Esme's dossier. Someone who claimed to have access to classified documents that would expose the true purpose of Operation Thermocline. As Nolan's boat limped back into Mayaro harbour, its engine smoking from the brutal chase, Kieran made his decision. He would find Lucia 26 and obtain those classified documents, even if it meant putting himself in even greater danger. Because somewhere in the depths of the Caribbean Sea, something was waiting. Something that powerful people had been willing to orchestrate coups, murder witnesses, and maintain decades-long conspiracies to protect. And Kieran Alwyn was determined to expose the truth, no matter what horrors that truth might reveal. The contact information for Lucia 26 had been carefully encoded in Esme's dossier, requiring Kieran to follow a complex series of digital breadcrumbs through encrypted messaging services and anonymous file-sharing sites. The process took him 2 days of careful work, operating from internet cafes across Port of Spain, while constantly watching for signs of surveillance. Finally, on Sunday evening, he received a response. Coordinates for a location in the Northern Range Mountains, a time, midnight, and a simple instruction: come alone, bring nothing electronic. The rendezvous site was an abandoned World War II radar station perched on a mountaintop overlooking the north coast. During the war, Trinidad had served as a crucial Allied base, and the mountains were dotted with the remains of military installations built to watch for German U-boats. Most had been forgotten by history, making them perfect for clandestine meetings. Kieran arrived early, parking his borrowed car at the base of the mountain and hiking up the overgrown trail by moonlight. The ruins consisted of several concrete bunkers and a collapsed radio tower, all gradually being reclaimed by the tropical forest. But he wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the shadows as he approached the main bunker. Lucia 26 turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with greying hair and the kind of watchful eyes that suggested a career in intelligence work. She introduced herself only as Maria, and her accent carried hints of multiple Caribbean islands, someone who'd moved frequently and learned to blend in wherever necessary. "I've been waiting 34 years for someone to ask the right questions," Maria said, echoing Esme's words from days earlier. Operation Thermocline was just the beginning. What they built after the coup is still operating, and it's getting stronger. Maria's story began in 1986, when she'd been working as a translator for the US Embassy in Port of Spain. Her job had given her access to classified cables and diplomatic correspondence, including communications between the embassy's CIA station and various US government agencies. By 1989, she'd begun to notice patterns that disturbed her. The Americans weren't just interested in oil revenues, she explained, producing a thick envelope from her jacket. They were tracking something else, phenomena that started appearing in Caribbean waters during the 1980s. Anomalous sonar readings, electromagnetic disturbances, reports of mass marine die-offs in specific grid coordinates. The official explanation was deep-sea volcanic activity, but the classified reports told a different story. Maria handed Kieran a series of photocopied documents bearing CIA letterheads and classification stamps. The first was a memo dated March 15th, 1989, from the Director of Central Intelligence to the Secretary of Defense. Recommend immediate activation of deep watch protocols in Caribbean theatre. Magdalena site shows increased activity consistent with previous manifestations in 1938 and 1962. Local political destabilization may be necessary to establish proper monitoring infrastructure without interference from host government. The next document was even more explicit, a planning memo for Operation Thermocline that laid out the true objectives. Primary goal: destabilize Trinidad government sufficiently to allow installation of deep-sea monitoring and containment facility at Magdalena site. Secondary goal: restructure energy sector to provide ongoing funding for deep watch operations through diverted petroleum revenues. Tertiary goal: eliminate local witnesses and establish long-term intelligence assets. Kieran felt his hands trembling as he read. The coup had been orchestrated not just to steal oil money, but to enable the construction of some kind of containment facility. The question was, what were they trying to contain? Keep reading, Maria urged. The next memo explains everything. The document that followed was a scientific assessment dated June 1990, classified at the highest levels and bearing the seal of a Pentagon research division Kieran had never heard of. The content was almost impossible to believe. Geological surveys confirm that the Magdalena deep water site sits directly above a subsurface cavity of unknown origin. Sonar penetration suggests a hollow space approximately 50 miles in diameter, located 15,000 feet below sea level. Cavity appears to be artificial in nature, with geometric structures and energy signatures inconsistent with natural formation. Of greatest concern are the periodic emergence events occurring every 28 years. During these events, massive bioluminescent phenomena appear in the water column above the site, accompanied by electromagnetic pulses, gravitational anomalies, and what can only be described as structured acoustic signals of non-human origin. Previous emergence events, 1938 and 1962, were contained through minimal local intervention. However, projections indicate that the 1990 event will be significantly more powerful and may require active suppression measures to prevent surface manifestation. Kieran looked up at Maria, his worldview reeling. This is claiming there's some kind of... what? Alien presence in the Caribbean Sea? Not alien, Maria corrected. Something much older. Something that was here long before humans arrived in the Caribbean. The indigenous peoples knew about it. Their myths speak of underwater cities and sleeping gods that wake with the turning of the moon cycles. The Spanish conquistadors encountered it too, though their records were quickly buried by the church. She handed him another document, this one a historical analysis compiled by Pentagon researchers. Archaeological evidence suggests that various pre-Columbian civilizations in the Caribbean were aware of the Magdalena anomaly and developed sophisticated suppression rituals to prevent emergence events. These rituals appear to have been practiced continuously until the Spanish conquest disrupted the indigenous power structures. The absence of ritual suppression may explain the increasing intensity of emergence events in the modern era. Recommend investigation of historical ritual practices for potential incorporation into contemporary containment protocols. That's where the secret society comes in, Maria explained. The Lodge of the Broken Crown. They're not just power-hungry conspirators. They're the modern guardians, the ones who perform the rituals necessary to keep whatever's down there asleep. The coup wasn't just about money and power. It was about ensuring they had the resources and political control necessary to maintain the suppression. Kieran felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The ritual chamber at the Hearn estate, the photographs of robed figures, the dates carved into the altar. All of it was connected to a cyclic pattern of containment rituals designed to prevent something ancient and terrible from rising from the depths. But why the elaborate financial conspiracy, he asked. Why steal oil revenues to fund this? Because maintaining a deep-sea containment facility is extraordinarily expensive, Maria replied. The technology required to suppress emergence events, specialised acoustic systems, electromagnetic field generators, the underwater installation itself, it costs billions of dollars, and it has to be funded secretly without congressional oversight or international monitoring. The final document in Maria's collection was the most chilling. A progress report dated December 1992. Phase 1 suppression successful. 1990 emergence event contained with minimal surface manifestation. Underwater facility operational and monitoring improved acoustic signatures. However, analysis indicates that the entity's response to containment measures is evolutionary in nature. Each suppression cycle results in increased complexity and adaptability. Recommend acceleration of Phase 2 protocols. The traditional 28-year cycle appears to be shortening. Next emergence event projected for 2018, with subsequent events occurring at 18-year intervals. Current containment measures may prove insufficient. Research Division recommends investigation of permanent solutions. 2018, Kieran whispered. That's 6 years ago. What happened in 2018? Maria's expression darkened. That's when the deep-sea mining operations began. Officially, they're extracting rare earth minerals from the ocean floor. Unofficially, they're using shaped charges and directed energy weapons to try to collapse the cavity system permanently. They're not trying to contain it anymore, they're trying to kill it. And if they succeed, then the Caribbean Sea becomes a dead zone, and millions of people lose their livelihoods. But if they fail... Maria paused, looking out at the lights of Port of Spain twinkling far below. If they fail, something that's been sleeping for millennia wakes up angry, and we discover that human civilization has been living on borrowed time. As dawn began to break over the mountains, Maria gathered up the documents and prepared to disappear back into whatever shadows had hidden her for 3 decades. But before leaving, she gave Kieran one final piece of information. "There's a vault beneath the old treasury building in Port of Spain," she said. "Colonial-era construction, built on the site of an old indigenous temple. The lodge uses it for their most important rituals, and it contains the original suppression protocols, the ones developed by the Taino and Caribs centuries ago. If you want to understand what's really happening, that's where you'll find the complete truth." "And if I'm caught there?" Maria smiled grimly. "Then you'll join the long list of people who've disappeared while investigating the Magdalena project. But Kieran, someone has to try. The 2024 emergence event is coming, and from what my sources tell me, the containment systems are already failing. The lights in the water are getting brighter, and the songs from the deep are getting louder." As Maria melted back into the forest, leaving Kieran alone with the weight of impossible knowledge, he realised that his investigation had evolved far beyond simple fraud detection. He was now the guardian of secrets that could reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the world, or get him killed by people who would do anything to keep those secrets buried. The sun was rising over the Caribbean, painting the sea in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere beneath those peaceful waters, something ancient was stirring, counting down to an emergence that might be the last one human civilization would witness. And Kieran Alwyn, forensic accountant turned reluctant investigator of cosmic horror, was running out of time to stop it. The old treasury building stood in the heart of Port of Spain like a monument to colonial ambition, its neoclassical facade hiding centuries of Caribbean history. Built in 1848 on the site of an ancient Taino ceremonial ground, it had served various government functions before being abandoned in the 1980s. Now it waited, empty and forgotten, while something far older than bureaucracy slumbered in the vaults beneath its foundation. Kieran spent 2 days studying the building's layout, using his forensic skills to trace architectural plans, utility maps, and historical records. The official blueprints showed only the ground floor and a small basement, but Maria's intelligence suggested something much more extensive. Cross-referencing with geological surveys and old Spanish colonial documents, he found references to sacred caverns and suppression chambers that predated European settlement by centuries. On Wednesday night, as storm clouds gathered over the capital, Kieran made his approach. The building's security was minimal. A few cameras and motion sensors designed to deter casual vandals, not sophisticated infiltrators. Using skills learned from years of white-collar investigation, he disabled the alarms and slipped inside through a rear service entrance. The interior was a maze of dusty offices and abandoned file rooms, but Kieran followed Maria's directions to a seemingly innocuous storage closet on the ground floor. Behind stacks of mouldering paperwork, he found what he was looking for, a hidden panel that opened to reveal stone steps leading downward into darkness. The stairs were ancient, carved from volcanic rock and worn smooth by centuries of use. Symbols were etched into the walls, not the Masonic imagery he'd seen at the Hearn estate, but older markings that seemed to writhe and shift in his flashlight beam. Taino petroglyphs intertwined with symbols that resembled nothing in any human language, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. The first level below ground was clearly colonial construction, brick archways and iron gates that spoke of Spanish engineering. But as Kieran descended further, the architecture changed, becoming something that predated European arrival by millennia. The walls were covered in polished obsidian, and the air thrummed with a barely audible vibration that seemed to come from the stone itself. At the bottom of the stairs, Kieran found himself in a vast circular chamber, dominated by a raised altar that was definitely not of human construction. The surface was covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and flow in the darkness, depicting scenes of underwater cities, tentacled beings, and cosmic geometries that defied rational analysis. But surrounding the altar were clear signs of more recent activity. Dozens of candles had been arranged in specific patterns, their wax pooling and hardening over years of repeated rituals. Modern photographs were scattered across the altar's surface, surveillance images of the Magdalena site, sonar readings of the underwater facility, and most disturbing of all, pictures of what appeared to be massive tentacled forms moving through the deep-sea installation. A leather-bound journal lay open beside the photographs, its pages filled with handwritten notes in multiple languages. Kieran recognised English, Spanish, and what might have been Portuguese, but there were also symbols and markings that bore no resemblance to any terrestrial writing system. The most recent entry was dated just 3 days earlier. The signs are accelerating. The acoustic monitoring stations report harmonic frequencies increasing by 15% weekly. Deep-sea mining operations have had minimal effect on cavity integrity. The entity appears to be adapting to our suppression attempts. Dr. Holloway's team believes we may have triggered a defensive response rather than achieving containment. Emergency sessions scheduled for New Moon. The Grand Lodge has authorised activation of terminal protocol if emergence cannot be prevented. Better to scorch the sea than let it wake fully. Kieran photographed every page of the journal, his hands shaking as he documented evidence of a conspiracy that spanned centuries. The terminal protocol, whatever it was, sounded like a final desperate measure, and the casual reference to scorching the sea suggested something with catastrophic environmental implications. As he worked, the vibration in the chamber seemed to intensify, and the candle flames began to flicker despite the absence of any wind. The obsidian walls appeared to pulse with their own internal light, and Kieran could swear he heard something that sounded almost like singing, a deep, harmonic chorus that seemed to come from somewhere far below the chamber. That was when he noticed the narrow passage leading away from the main altar, descending even further into the bedrock beneath Port of Spain. Against every instinct of self-preservation, Kieran followed the passage, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't quite explain. The tunnel led to a smaller chamber that was definitely of pre-Columbian construction. The walls were covered in murals that depicted the history of whatever slept beneath the Caribbean, scenes of its arrival from distant stars, its interactions with indigenous peoples, and the development of the ritual cycles that had kept it dormant for millennia. But dominating the chamber was a massive stone relief that took Kieran's breath away. It showed the underwater city in perfect detail, a vast complex of impossible architecture sprawling across the ocean floor, with geometries that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. At its centre sat a colossal figure that was part octopus, part dragon, part something that had no name in human language. And surrounding this figure were dozens of human forms, tiny by comparison, performing what was clearly a suppression ritual. The humans held objects that resembled acoustic devices, and streams of energy flowed from these instruments toward the sleeping entity, forming a containment matrix that held it in dormancy. Below the relief, carved in multiple languages including English, Spanish, and what Kieran now recognised as Taino script, was a warning. When the stars align as they did at the first awakening, and the deep songs grow strong enough to shatter stone, then shall the sleeper rise unless the children of the land perform the great suppression. But know this, each suppression grows weaker as the sleeper grows stronger, and the day will come when no human voice can hold back the tide of awakening. The implications were staggering. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean hadn't just been aware of the entity beneath the sea, they'd been its guardians, performing regular rituals to keep it dormant. The colonial conquest had disrupted these rituals, leading to the increasingly powerful emergence events of the modern era. And now, according to the journal upstairs, the containment was failing completely. Kieran was so absorbed in photographing the mural that he almost missed the sound of footsteps echoing from the tunnel above. But as voices reached him from the main chamber, he realised his worst fears had come true. The lodge had arrived for their emergency session, and he was trapped in their most sacred ritual space. Moving as quietly as possible, he extinguished his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall of the smaller chamber, hoping the shadows would conceal him. Through the narrow tunnel, he could hear the ceremony beginning, dozens of voices chanting in languages both human and decidedly non-human. But as the ritual intensified, something else began to happen. The obsidian walls started glowing with their own internal light, and the harmonic singing he'd heard earlier grew louder, as if something far below was responding to the lodge's ceremony. The entity beneath the Caribbean wasn't just stirring in its sleep, it was beginning to wake up. And Kieran Alwyn, trapped in an ancient chamber with nowhere to run, was about to witness the beginning of humanity's greatest nightmare. The chanting above grew louder and more frenzied as the lodge performed their emergency ritual, but something was going wrong. Instead of the controlled suppression ceremony described in the journal, this felt desperate, panicked. The sound of people who had lost control of something they'd spent centuries trying to contain. Through the narrow tunnel connecting the chambers, Kieran could see flickering candlelight and the shadows of robed figures moving around the altar. But underneath their voices, he could hear something else, a deep resonant response that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. The entity was no longer sleeping, it was listening, and perhaps beginning to answer. The obsidian walls of the chamber where Kieran hid were now pulsing with rhythmic light, matching the cadence of whatever vast presence stirred in the depths below. And with each pulse, the temperature dropped noticeably until his breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. That was when he heard his name being called. Kieran Alwyn, a voice echoed through the stone chambers, spoken by someone in the ritual above. We know you're here. We know what you've discovered. Come join us and learn the full truth of your investigation. He had two choices: remain hidden and hope they wouldn't find him, or face whatever was waiting in the main chamber. But as the walls around him began to crack under some immense pressure from below, the decision was made for him. The smaller chamber was no longer stable. Kieran emerged from the tunnel to find himself facing 24 robed figures arranged around the altar, their faces hidden by ceremonial masks depicting various sea creatures. At their centre stood a familiar figure, Dr. Richard Holloway, the same man whose emails had started this entire investigation. Mr. Alwyn, Holloway said, removing his mask to reveal a face lined with exhaustion and something approaching madness. You've been very persistent in your investigation. Unfortunately, you've also been very naive about what you were investigating. The other lodge members remained silent, but Kieran could feel their attention focused on him with uncomfortable intensity. Several held what appeared to be ceremonial weapons, curved blades that gleamed with an oily iridescent sheen. You think we're the villains in this story, Holloway continued, stepping closer to the altar where the journal still lay open. You believe we orchestrated the coup for money and power, but let me ask you something. What do you think would happen if we stopped? As if summoned by his words, a tremor ran through the building above them, followed by a sound like whale song amplified through a cathedral organ. Dust fell from the ceiling, and several of the candles guttered out despite the still air. That, Holloway said grimly, is what happens when the suppression protocols weaken, and it's been getting stronger every day since our deep-sea operations began. We thought we could kill it, use technology to accomplish what ritual had been failing to achieve. Instead, we've only made it angry. Another tremor shook the chamber, this one strong enough to crack one of the obsidian walls. Through the crack, Kieran could see something that defied explanation. What looked like water flowing upward, carrying with it phosphorescent organisms that pulsed in perfect synchronization. The emergence is beginning, one of the other lodge members said, her voice tight with barely controlled terror. 6 years ahead of schedule, the acoustic containment grid is failing, and the mining operations have destabilized the cavity structure. Holloway nodded grimly. Which brings us to why you're here, Mr. Alwyn. We need someone to carry a message to the surface. Someone who understands the scope of what's happening but isn't bound by our oaths of secrecy. What message? Kieran asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. That terminal protocol is being activated. In 72 hours, we're going to detonate a series of nuclear devices in the Magdalena cavity. The resulting seismic activity should collapse the entire system permanently, but it will also contaminate thousands of square miles of ocean and likely trigger tsunamis throughout the Caribbean. The implications hit Kieran like a physical blow. You're talking about ecological genocide. Millions of people depend on these waters for their livelihood. Better a dead sea than a world where humanity serves as food for something that regards us as we regard plankton, Holloway replied. The entity beneath the Caribbean isn't just some large sea creature, Mr. Alwyn. It's a cosmic intelligence that existed before life on Earth evolved beyond simple bacteria. If it fully awakens, human civilization ends, not through conquest, but through absorption into something so alien that the concepts of individuality and free will become meaningless. As if to emphasize his point, another tremor shook the chamber, and this time the cracks in the walls spread noticeably. Through the growing fissures, Kieran could see something that made his mind recoil. Geometry that existed in impossible dimensions, structures that seemed to be simultaneously near and infinitely distant. The ritual isn't working anymore, one of the lodge members reported, consulting what appeared to be a tablet computer, incongruously modern, amid the ancient ceremony. Acoustic readings are off the charts. Whatever's down there is actively fighting the suppression field. Holloway turned back to Kieran with desperate urgency. This is your choice, Mr. Alwyn. Help us evacuate as many people as possible from the coastal areas before Terminal Protocol activates, or watch the entire Caribbean become a staging ground for something that will eventually consume the planet. But before Kieran could respond, the ground beneath them began to buckle upward, as if some titanic force was pushing against the bedrock from below. The remaining candles were extinguished by a wind that carried the smell of deep ocean trenches and things that had been dead for geological ages. "It's too late," someone screamed. "The cavity breach is accelerating." In the sudden darkness, lit only by the pulsing glow from the cracked walls, Kieran saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Through the largest fissure, a single eye opened, an eye the size of a building, ancient beyond measure, and focused with terrible intelligence on the humans gathered in the chamber above. The entity beneath the Caribbean had awakened, and it was aware of their presence. "Run," Holloway whispered, but his voice was already changing, taking on harmonics that no human throat should be able to produce. "Run, and tell them what you've seen. Tell them that the sleeper rises, and the long dream of human independence is ending." Kieran didn't need to be told twice. As the chamber began to collapse around them, and the lodge members started to scream in voices that were no longer entirely their own, he fled up the stone stairs toward the surface, carrying with him the weight of knowledge that no one would believe and evidence that would soon be erased. Behind him, the old treasury building groaned and settled as something immense pressed upward from the depths below. By the time he reached the street, windows were already beginning to shatter throughout downtown Port of Spain, and a sound like whale song was echoing from storm drains and water mains across the city. The emergence had begun, and Kieran Alwyn was the only witness who understood what it meant. But his journey was far from over. He had 72 hours to somehow convince the world that an ancient cosmic entity was awakening beneath the Caribbean Sea, and that humanity's only hope of survival lay in the hands of a secret society that had just been consumed by the very thing they'd spent centuries trying to contain. The irony wasn't lost on him that after weeks of investigating a financial conspiracy, he'd discovered something far more valuable and far more terrifying than stolen oil revenue. The knowledge that humanity had never been alone on Earth, and that its cosmic landlords were finally coming to collect the rent. 3 days later, seismic monitoring stations across the Caribbean recorded what was officially classified as a deep-sea volcanic event. The explosion was visible from space, sending a column of superheated water and steam miles into the atmosphere. Tsunamis struck coastlines from Venezuela to Jamaica, though advance warnings had minimized casualties. Kieran Alwyn was found 3 days after the explosion, wandering the streets of Port of Spain in a state of severe psychological distress. He claimed to be a forensic accountant investigating oil revenue fraud, but had no memory of the preceding weeks. Medical examination revealed evidence of recent trauma, including exposure to extreme cold and what appeared to be mild radiation poisoning. He was quietly committed to St. Anne's Hospital for psychiatric evaluation after attacking a journalist who tried to interview him about sea monsters and cosmic conspiracies. All records of his investigation into the Trinidad archives were sealed by court order, and the archives themselves were destroyed in a fire that officials attributed to electrical malfunction. Esme Dandridge's house burned down the same night, though she was not found among the remains. Nolan Bastow, the fisherman who had guided Kieron to the Magdalena site, disappeared during the seismic event and was presumed drowned. The woman known as Maria or Lucia 26 was never seen again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the trade winds are still and the Caribbean lies flat as glass, fishermen report hearing something like singing from the deep waters off Trinidad's coast, and occasionally packages wash ashore on remote beaches, waterproof containers holding documents, photographs, and recordings that tell fragments of an impossible story. One such package was recovered near Havana 6 months after the Magdalena event. It contained a single sheet of paper bearing just one line, written in Kieran Alwyn's careful handwriting: "The flame still burns below the lake." Whether this was meant as warning or promise, no one could say. But in the depths of the Caribbean Sea, where ancient things sleep fitfully in chambers of stone and coral, something vast and patient continues to dream of the day when the stars align correctly and the suppression protocols finally fail completely. The Pitch Lake Protocol, as historians would later call it, remains classified at the highest levels of government. But for those who know where to look, the evidence is still there, in unexplained seismic readings, in the migration patterns of deep-sea creatures, and in the nightmares of those who live too close to waters that hide secrets older than human memory. The investigation is over, but the story continues, written in phosphorescent patterns beneath waves that carry echoes of songs no human voice should know how to sing. And somewhere in the depths below, ancient eyes open occasionally to regard the surface world with patient, terrible intelligence, counting down to an emergence that may be inevitable, but perhaps with vigilance and sacrifice, not yet. The Caribbean keeps its secrets, but they are secrets that grow stronger with each passing tide, waiting for the day when the children of the deep finally rise to reclaim a world that was never truly ours to begin with. Hello there, fellow seekers of the strange and unexplained. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I'm curious about you, our listeners scattered across this vast world of ours. How has your day been treating you? What time is it where you are right now? Are you listening from a bustling city, a quiet suburban home, or perhaps somewhere more remote? I love knowing that our community spans continents and time zones, united by our fascination with the mysteries that lurk just beneath the surface of our everyday reality. Speaking of mysteries, if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unknown, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. Your support helps us continue exploring the darkest corners of conspiracy, the paranormal, and those unsettling questions that keep us awake at night. Now, settle in as we explore a story that will make you question the very nature of memory, reality, and truth itself. Dr. Cassia Moreno had always prided herself on her ability to find patterns where others saw only chaos. It was this talent that had earned her a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from Stanford, a prestigious research position studying memory formation, and eventually a lucrative contract with the Department of Defense. But as she sat in her sterile government office in Arlington, Virginia, staring at the data scrolling across her monitor, she wished for once that her pattern recognition skills would fail her. The contract had seemed straightforward enough when she'd signed on 6 months ago. The Pentagon wanted her to analyse psychological anomalies appearing in national security background screenings. Nothing too unusual there. The military had always been paranoid about mental fitness. What they hadn't told her was just how widespread these anomalies had become. Cassia rubbed her tired eyes and took another sip of her cold coffee. It was well past midnight, but she couldn't tear herself away from the data. The numbers were staggering. In the past 18 months, over 3,000 federal employees, military personnel and contractors had failed routine psychological evaluations, not because of mental illness or instability, but because they had given consistently wrong answers to what should have been simple questions about commonly known facts. She pulled up the first case file. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, Army Intelligence, 15-year veteran with an exemplary record, applying for a higher security clearance. During his evaluation, he had insisted that the popular children's book series was called The Berenstein Bears, not Berenstain Bears. When shown the actual books with the correct spelling, he became agitated, claiming someone had changed them. The second file, Air Traffic Controller Janet Morrison, FAA. 23 years of flawless service. During her routine psychological assessment, she maintained that Nelson Mandela had died in prison in the 1980s, not in 2013 as former president. She provided specific details about watching his funeral on television, details that matched no historical record. The third, FBI Agent David Chen, Counterintelligence Division. He argued vehemently that there were 52 United States, not 50. When pressed, he couldn't name the additional 2 states but remained absolutely certain of the number. File after file revealed the same disturbing pattern. Highly trained, mentally stable individuals with impeccable records were suddenly remembering a different version of reality. What made Cassia's skin crawl wasn't the wrong answers themselves. False memories were well documented in psychological literature. What terrified her was the consistency. The same wrong answers given by completely unrelated people across the country. People who had never met, never communicated, yet shared identical false memories down to the smallest details. It defied everything she knew about how memory worked. Cassia opened a new document and began typing her preliminary report, but paused when she noticed something else in the files. A single phrase kept appearing in the margins of the evaluation reports, always handwritten by different assessors. Project Manifold, Level E access only. She tried searching the Pentagon's database for any reference to Project Manifold. Access denied. She tried the Defense Intelligence Agency. Access denied. Every search led to the same digital wall, the same terse message. Insufficient clearance level. Cassia leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. In her 3 decades of scientific research, she had learned to trust her instincts. And right now, every instinct was screaming that she had stumbled onto something much larger and more dangerous than a simple psychological study. She picked up her secure phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in over 5 years. Haruto, it's Cassia Moreno. I know it's late, but I need to talk to you about something. Something involving CERN and quantum mechanics. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Cassia, Dr. Haruto Seldine's voice was barely above a whisper. Are you calling from a secure line? Of course, Pentagon issued. Why? Another pause. Because if you're calling me about what I think you're calling about, then they're already watching you. The coffee shop in Georgetown was crowded enough to provide cover, but not so packed that their conversation would be drowned out. Cassia had chosen a corner table with clear sight lines to all entrances, a habit she'd developed during her early consulting work with the CIA. Dr. Haruto Seldin arrived precisely on time, looking older than his 63 years, his once black hair now silver, his dark eyes carrying the weight of secrets. You look like hell, Haruto, Cassia said as he sat down across from her. So do you, but then most people do once they start seeing the cracks. He ordered black coffee from the approaching waitress and waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. Tell me what you found. Cassia slid a tablet across the table, showing him her compiled data on the psychological anomalies. Haruto's expression grew darker with each page he scrolled through. The Mandela effect, he said finally. That's what they're calling it now, isn't it? Named after that woman, Fiona Broome, who first documented the phenomenon online. You know about this? Know about it? Haruto laughed bitterly. Cassia, I helped create it. The words hit her like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Haruto glanced around the coffee shop nervously before leaning forward. 2012. You remember I left CERN abruptly, told everyone I was burned out, wanted to return to private research. Yes, you never explained why. I couldn't. I'd signed NDAs that would have landed me in federal prison for the rest of my life. But things have changed. The project is supposed to be shut down, and frankly, I'm tired of carrying this alone. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I was recruited for something called the Manifold Initiative. Officially, it was dimensional stability fieldwork. Unofficially, it was the most dangerous experiment in human history. Cassia felt her mouth go dry. Explain. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN, and several smaller facilities like it around the world, don't just smash particles together for research. The energy levels we achieve, the exotic matter we create, it has unintended consequences. We started noticing small discrepancies in our data, tiny variations in physical constants, minute changes in historical records stored in our databases. Changes? At first we thought it was equipment malfunction or data corruption, but then we started comparing notes with other facilities, cross-referencing with historical archives. The discrepancies were real, and they were spreading. Small tears in what we call space-time, micro-fractures that allowed alternate versions of reality to bleed through. Cassia stared at him in disbelief. You're talking about parallel universes. I'm talking about the multiverse, Cassia. The theory that every quantum possibility creates a separate timeline, a separate reality. We discovered that these realities aren't as separate as we thought. Under certain conditions, they can overlap, interfere with each other, and we had inadvertently created those conditions. Haruto reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. The Mandela effects people are experiencing aren't memory glitches, they're timeline fractures. The question isn't why people remember differently, it's why the record changed around them. He opened the folder and slid out 2 documents. Both appeared to be copies of the Declaration of Independence, aged and authentic looking. But there was a crucial difference. This one, Haruto pointed to the first document, refers to the 13 unified colonies. This one mentions the 13 United States. Both are from the National Archives. Both have matching provenance. Both exist simultaneously in our reality. Cassia examined the documents with growing horror. The handwriting was identical. The paper and ink appeared genuine. Even the water stains and age marks matched perfectly. But the words were different. How is this possible? Because we're living in a merged timeline, Cassia. Fragments of different realities bleeding together, creating inconsistencies that our brains struggle to process. Most people's minds simply adjust, accepting the new reality as it overwrites the old. But some people with certain neural patterns, certain types of memory formation, they retain traces of the original timeline. The people in my files? Exactly. They're not mentally ill or delusional. They're remembering correctly. They're just remembering a different version of reality that used to exist. Haruto's voice dropped to barely audible. And that's when the government got involved. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a barren landscape of scrub brush and red rock under the merciless afternoon sun. Cassia checked her GPS again, confirming she was still on course toward the coordinates Haruto had given her. The facility was supposed to be abandoned, shut down after the Manifold Initiative was terminated in 2014. But as she crested a low hill, she could see the signs of recent activity. The surface installation looked innocuous enough. A cluster of beige concrete buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Warning signs declared it a restricted government research facility, but they looked weathered and old. What caught Cassia's attention were the tyre tracks in the sand, too fresh to be from the facility's supposed shutdown 8 years ago. She had driven out here on impulse, needing to see the place Haruto had described with her own eyes. He had been reluctant to give her the location, warning her that even though the project was officially terminated, certain elements within the government might still be monitoring the site. But Cassia had pushed, and eventually he had relented. The Ananke ring, he had told her, named after the Greek goddess of necessity and fate. Ironic, considering what we were doing there. Now, standing at the fence in the desert heat, Cassia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had brought bolt cutters, telling herself she was just going to take a quick look around the perimeter, but as she cut through the chain link, she knew she was crossing a line from which there might be no return. The surface buildings were indeed abandoned, their windows dark and empty. But Haruto had told her the real facility was underground, accessible through a maintenance shaft hidden behind the main building. She found it exactly where he said it would be, a steel hatch nearly invisible among the concrete foundations. The ladder descended farther than she had expected, her flashlight beam disappearing into darkness below. When she finally reached the bottom, she found herself in a corridor carved from solid rock, stretching away into the mountain. Emergency lighting fixtures lined the walls, dark and dead. The air smelled of ozone and something else, something that made her skin crawl with an indefinable wrongness. Following the corridor, she emerged into a vast underground chamber that took her breath away. The Ananke ring stretched before her like the skeleton of some massive prehistoric creature. The particle accelerator tunnel was smaller than the one at CERN, but no less impressive, its superconducting magnets and detection equipment dark and silent. But it was what she found in the control room that made her blood run cold. Banks of servers lined the walls, their status lights blinking softly in the darkness. They hadn't been shut down. They were running on auxiliary power, maintaining something even after all these years. Cassia found a terminal that was still active and began scrolling through the system logs. What she read made her hands shake. Timeline variant 57, Looney Tunes/Toons, probability shift successful. TVO session 12, Mandela test cohort, memory pattern stable. Session abort, Princess Diana lives timeline, cascade effect detected. Reality anchor points, Nelson Mandela death shift, implementation complete. Berenstain variant, low-level reality bleed, monitoring ongoing. Page after page of session logs detailed deliberate attempts to alter reality, to shift timelines and manipulate collective memory. This wasn't accidental bleed-through from parallel universes, it was weaponized reality manipulation. Cassia found a folder labelled Operation Memory Garden and opened it with trembling fingers. The documents inside outlined a collaboration between the Department of Defense, the CIA, and several private defence contractors. The goal was to use quantum resonance frequencies to shift perception, to alter collective memory patterns, and ultimately to rewrite history itself. Some experiments had been small-scale tests, changing minor details like cartoon character names or the spelling of children's books. Others were more ambitious, attempting to erase entire political scandals or alter the outcomes of elections. A few entries made reference to cosmic-level interventions, attempts to change major historical events. The final document in the folder was dated just 6 months ago. It was titled Phase 3 Implementation, Mass Memory Synchronization. The summary made Cassia's stomach turn. Following successful small-scale reality modifications, recommend proceeding to Phase 3, Complete Timeline Consolidation. Using satellite-based quantum resonance arrays, we can achieve global memory synchronization, eliminating dangerous alternate timelines and establishing a single controlled narrative of history. Cassia printed every document she could find, her scientific training warring with her growing terror. She had always believed in the primacy of truth, in the objective reality of facts and evidence. But what she was reading suggested that truth itself could be manipulated, that reality was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. As she prepared to leave, she noticed one final folder labelled the Rememberer's Security Threat Assessment. Inside were photographs and dossiers of people from around the world, civilians, military personnel, scientists, all connected by one common thread. They remembered alternate versions of reality. At the top of the list was her own photograph, with a note written in red ink: Priority target, containment protocol approved. Cassia barely slept for 3 days after her return from Nevada. Every shadow seemed to hide a government agent. Every phone call might be her last. She had uploaded the documents from the Ananke ring to multiple encrypted cloud servers and sent copies to journalists, scientists, and anyone else she thought might be able to help expose the truth. But so far the response had been minimal. A few conspiracy theory websites had picked up the story, but mainstream media dismissed it as elaborate fiction. That changed when she received a message through her encrypted email account. Dr. Moreno, if you're reading this, then you've seen behind the curtain. You're not alone. There are others who remember, others who know the truth. If you want answers, meet us at the coordinates attached. Come alone and watch for surveillance. The timeline depends on it. MP. The coordinates led her to an abandoned warehouse in Baltimore, a 3-hour drive from her Arlington apartment. Cassia arrived after dark. Her nerves stretched to the breaking point. The warehouse appeared empty, but as she approached the loading dock, a door opened and a shadowy figure beckoned her inside. Dr. Moreno, I'm Malik Price. The man who greeted her was in his 40s with greying hair and the bearing of a career military officer. Thank you for coming. We've been following your work with great interest. He led her through the dark warehouse to a hidden room behind a false wall. Inside, she found something she hadn't expected. A sophisticated command centre filled with computers, monitors, and communication equipment. More surprising were the dozen people working at various stations, all turning to look at her as she entered. Welcome to the Rememberers, Malik said. We're what you might call the Resistance. Resistance to what? To having our reality stolen from us. A woman approached from one of the computer terminals. She was young, maybe 30, with the intense eyes of someone who had seen too much. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. Until 2 years ago, I was a quantum physicist at MIT. Then I started remembering things that supposedly never happened. Like what? Like the fact that Australia used to be much farther south. Like the fact that the human heart is located in the centre of the chest, not shifted to the left. Like the fact that there used to be 52 states, not 50. Sarah's voice grew angry. But every time I tried to research these memories, I found that reality had been changed around me. Maps were different, anatomy textbooks had been altered, historical records didn't match what I remembered. Malik gestured toward a large wall map covered in coloured pins. We've been tracking timeline anomalies for 5 years now. Each pin represents a confirmed reality shift, a place where multiple people remember the same alternate version of history. The pattern is clear, the shifts are accelerating, and they're becoming more invasive. Cassia studied the map, her scientist's mind automatically analysing the data. The clusters follow population centres, but there are outliers. What causes the geographical variations? We think it's related to quantum field fluctuations, said another man, introducing himself as Dr. James Morrison, a former CERN researcher. Areas with high electromagnetic activity, places near particle accelerators or military installations, seem to be more susceptible to timeline bleed. But it's not random, Sarah added. We've identified clear patterns in the types of changes being made. Historical events that made the government look bad are being erased. Scientific discoveries that challenge official narratives are being altered. Even popular culture is being modified to remove subversive messages. Malik pulled up a chair and sat across from Cassia. We know about your discovery at the Ananke Ring. We've been aware of Project Manifold for years, but we could never prove it existed. Your documentation is the first concrete evidence we've seen. How many of you are there? More than you might think, fewer than we need. The problem is identification. Most people don't realise their memories have been altered. The brain is remarkably adaptable. When reality changes around them, they simply accept the new version as correct. Only certain individuals retain traces of the original timeline. What makes them different? Dr. Morrison leaned forward. We're still researching that, but we have some theories. People with certain neurological conditions, individuals who work with quantum physics or advanced mathematics, military personnel exposed to classified electromagnetic experiments, they seem to be more resistant to memory modification. Sarah activated a large monitor showing a timeline chart. What we've discovered is that the reality shifts aren't permanent. They exist in a state of quantum superposition, constantly fighting against each other. The more people who remember the original timeline, the more unstable the altered version becomes. Which is why they're trying to eliminate us, Malik said grimly. Every person who remembers the truth weakens their control over reality. They call us a security threat, but we prefer to think of ourselves as the immune system of the universe. Cassia felt a chill as she realised the implications. The document I found mentioned Phase 3, mass memory synchronization. They're planning something big. We know, Malik nodded. Our intelligence suggests they're preparing to activate a global quantum resonance network. Satellites, ground-based transmitters, maybe even the cell phone infrastructure. If they succeed, they'll be able to rewrite history on a planetary scale. And eliminate anyone who remembers the truth in the process, Sarah added quietly. The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled over them. They weren't just fighting for their own memories, they were fighting for the very nature of reality itself. So, what do we do? Cassia asked finally. Malik smiled grimly. We remember, we document, and we make sure the truth survives, no matter what version of reality they try to force on us. The changes started small. Cassia first noticed them 3 weeks after her meeting with the Rememberers, subtle alterations to her apartment that made her question her own sanity. The kitchen layout was reversed, with the sink on the right instead of the left. Family photos showed events she didn't remember attending. Her college diploma hung on the wall with a slightly different date. But it was her personal journals that truly terrified her. Cassia had kept detailed research notes for over 20 years, documenting her work in cognitive science with meticulous precision. Now, flipping through the pages, she found entries in her own handwriting describing experiments she had never conducted, conclusions she had never reached, and most disturbing of all, warnings she had never written. Reality is not constant, read one entry dated 6 months earlier. The timeline shifts are accelerating. If you're reading this and don't remember writing it, then you're experiencing temporal displacement. Trust your instincts, not your environment. CM, another entry, supposedly from just last week. They're coming. The manifold protocol has been activated. Find the rememberers. Find the truth. Don't let them erase us all. CM. Cassia's hand shook as she read her own words she had no memory of writing. The implications were staggering. Not only was reality being actively manipulated, but her own timeline was becoming unstable. She was losing pieces of herself to alternate versions that apparently existed simultaneously. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Malik. Emergency meeting. They've found us. Bring everything. The warehouse in Baltimore was in chaos when Cassia arrived. Equipment was being hastily packed, computers wiped, and documents shredded. Malik met her at the door, his face grim. We've been compromised. Federal agents raided 3 of our safe houses this morning. They're calling us domestic terrorists, claiming we're spreading dangerous disinformation. He handed her a tablet showing news reports from around the country. But that's not the worst part. The news footage showed government officials holding press conferences, scientists at podiums, all speaking with absolute authority about the dangers of false memory syndrome and the need for cognitive correction therapy for affected individuals. The reports mentioned a new treatment being developed by the Department of Health and Human Services in collaboration with defence contractors, a process that could repair damaged memories and restore normal brain function. They're not just hunting us anymore, Sarah said, approaching with a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. They're preparing to medicalise dissent. Anyone who remembers alternate timelines will be declared mentally ill and subjected to forced treatment. Forced memory modification, Dr. Morrison added. They're turning the weapons they use to alter reality into medical procedures. It's brilliant and terrifying. Cassia felt the walls closing in around them. How long do we have? According to our sources inside the government, the mass synchronization event is scheduled for next week, Malik replied. Operation Recall Loop. They'll use every available transmission method, satellites, cell towers, even the emergency broadcast system, to send quantum resonance frequencies designed to align all human memory patterns to a single, approved timeline. What timeline? One where Project Manifold never existed, where alternate realities are impossible, where anyone who claims to remember differently is suffering from a treatable mental disorder. Sarah's voice was bitter. They're not just rewriting history, they're rewriting the rules of what's possible. The group worked frantically to salvage what they could from their research, uploading files to decentralized networks, sending copies to contacts around the world, hoping that some record of the truth would survive the coming purge. But as they worked, reality continued to shift around them. Cassia watched in horror as newspaper headlines changed while she was reading them, as photographs flickered between different versions of the same events, as the very text on her computer screen rewrote itself in real time. The timeline was becoming unstable, possibly as a result of their resistance to the official narrative. It's starting, Doctor, Morrison said, pointing to his quantum field detectors. The resonance frequencies are building. They're running preliminary tests. Through the warehouse windows, Cassia could see the night sky flickering strangely, as if reality itself was having trouble maintaining consistency. Stars appeared and disappeared, constellations shifted, and for a brief moment she swore she could see multiple moons in the sky simultaneously. Malik made a decision. We upload everything. Now full exposure. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence we have. We flood the internet with the truth before they can stop us. It won't matter, Sarah said quietly. Once they activate the global synchronization, none of this will exist. The new timeline won't include any of our discoveries. Then we make sure some of us remember, Cassia said suddenly. If they can modify memory with quantum frequencies, maybe we can shield ourselves from those frequencies. Dr. Morrison looked up from his equipment. Theoretically possible. We'd need to create a localized quantum interference field, something to disrupt their transmission, but the power requirements... The Ananke ring, Cassia interrupted. It's still active, still running on auxiliary power. If we could modify the resonance frequency, use it to broadcast a counter-signal. Malik stared at her. You want to go back to Nevada? to the heart of their operation. It's the only facility powerful enough to interfere with their satellite network, and it's the last place they'd expect us to make a stand. The decision was made quickly. As reality continued to fracture around them, the surviving rememberers loaded their equipment into vehicles and began the desperate journey across the country. They had perhaps 48 hours before Operation Recall Loop went live. 48 hours to save not just their memories, but the very possibility of alternate truth. As they drove through the night, Cassia watched the world outside change and shift. Roads appeared and disappeared, cities flickered between different versions of themselves, and the stars overhead rearranged themselves into unfamiliar patterns. They were living through the collapse of stable reality, witnessing the birth of a new world where truth would be whatever those in power decided it should be. But they still remembered, and as long as they remembered, there was hope. The final transmission from the Ananke Ring lasted exactly 17 minutes and 33 seconds. Government records claim it was a malfunction in the abandoned facility's power systems, a final surge of electricity through decaying equipment before permanent shutdown. But those who were listening, those who knew what to look for, heard something else entirely. Buried in the static of emergency radio frequencies, encoded in the background hum of satellite communications, scattered across the spectrum of human transmission, was a message. Not words exactly, but something deeper. A quantum signature that resonated with certain types of human consciousness. A signal designed to preserve memory across timeline shifts. The official reports state that Dr. Cassia Marino died in a tragic accident at the facility, along with several other individuals who had apparently broken into the site. Their bodies were found near the particle accelerator, victims of radiation exposure from the aging equipment. The incident was classified under national security protocols, and the site was sealed permanently. Operation Recall Loop launched on schedule, broadcasting synchronized memory patterns to a global audience through every available channel. News reports described it as a successful test of new emergency broadcast capabilities. Most people never noticed the brief static that interrupted their programs, the momentary disorientation as their memories aligned with the approved timeline. The Mandela effect disappeared from public discourse almost overnight. Scientific studies debunk the phenomenon as mass hysteria combined with normal memory formation errors. Social media posts discussing alternate timelines were flagged as misinformation and removed. Support groups for people experiencing false memories were quietly disbanded, their members enrolled in cognitive therapy programs that proved remarkably effective. But the signal from Ananke Ring had done its work. In hidden corners of the internet, on forums that exist in the spaces between official surveillance, the rememberers still gather. They share fragments of alternate timelines, comparing notes on realities that officially never existed. They document the ongoing shifts, the subtle changes that most people never notice. They remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison. They remember 52 states. They remember when the human heart was centred in the chest and Australia was thousands of miles further south. They remember a world where governments couldn't rewrite the past with quantum frequencies and satellite transmissions. New members join regularly. People who wake up one morning to find their world slightly different than the day before. People who notice that their childhood memories don't match the history books. People who realise that their reality might not be as solid as they thought. The resistance continues as it must. Because as long as someone remembers the truth, any version of truth, the possibility exists for reality to shift again. Memory is the battlefield now, and the war for the nature of existence itself rages on in the spaces between what was, what is, and what might be. Dr. Cassia Moreno's final words, recorded on the equipment found at the Ananke Ring, serve as both warning and rallying cry for those who still remember. If you remember different, you're not broken, you're proof. Proof that reality is not singular, not fixed, not controlled by those who would shape it to their will. Every alternate memory is a crack in their perfect narrative. Every discrepancy is evidence that truth exists beyond their manipulation. Hold on to your memories. Compare them with others. Document everything. Because the moment we stop remembering, the moment we accept their version as the only version, is the moment we lose ourselves completely. The timestamp on the recording shows an impossible date, a day that never existed in the current timeline. But for those who remember, it serves as proof that Cassia Moreno and the others didn't die in vain. They became part of the signal itself, their consciousness encoded in the static between realities, waiting for the day when the truth can emerge again. In a small apartment in Georgetown, a former CERN physicist named Haruta Seldin sits at his computer, typing carefully chosen words onto forums that exist in the shadows of the internet. His message is simple, but it carries the weight of infinite possibilities. Do you remember when reality was different? Do you remember what they took from us? If you do, then you are not alone. We are the static in their signal, the noise in their perfect symphony. We are the rememberers, and we will not be erased. The war for reality continues, fought in memory and dream, in the spaces between certainty and doubt, and somewhere in the quantum foam that underlies all existence, alternate timelines press against the barriers, waiting for their chance to bleed through once again. Truth, it seems, is more resilient than those who would control it ever imagined. The manifold archive remains hidden but not destroyed, its secrets scattered like seeds across the infinite landscape of possibility. And every person who reads these words, who remembers things differently than the official record, becomes part of the archive themselves, a living repository of alternate truth in a world that has forgotten the meaning of the word. Remember, document, resist. Hello there, fellow truth seekers and curious minds. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are in this vast world of ours. Thank you for joining us here at Sleep Theories. What time is it where you are? And more importantly, where in this interconnected yet mysterious world are you tuning in from today? But here's what I'm really curious about. What do you think about the conspiracy we're about to explore? Do you believe it's possible that some of our world leaders might not be who they appear to be? Have you ever noticed something just slightly off about a politician's mannerisms or expressions that made you wonder? And speaking of conspiracies that keep you up at night, what theories would you like us to investigate next? Are you drawn to the mysteries of ancient civilizations and their hidden knowledge? The possibility of secret space programs operating beyond public view? The truth behind a missing time phenomena and memory manipulation? Or perhaps something closer to home? The real story behind social media algorithms and their influence on human behaviour? If you find yourself drawn to stories that peel back the layers of reality and question the official narratives we're fed daily, then you've found your home. Don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories and let us know in the comments what conspiracy rabbit holes you'd like us to dive down next. Your suggestions help shape our investigations into the shadows that lurk behind our seemingly ordinary world. Now, settle in as we explore a story that might just change how you look at the faces on your television screen forever. The autumn of 2026 brought an unusual chill to Geneva, Switzerland. Freelance photojournalist Wes Rowan had covered enough international summits to know that the real stories rarely happened on stage. They occurred in the spaces between official statements, in the micro-expressions that flashed across faces when leaders thought no one was watching, in the barely perceptible tells that revealed the human beneath the political mask. Wes had built his reputation on capturing these moments. His high-resolution Canon R5 Mark III, equipped with a 400mm telephoto lens, could freeze time at 1/8,000th of a second, revealing details that the human eye would miss in real-time motion. This particular assignment for Reuters seemed routine enough. Document the Global Policy Forum's annual gathering, where G20 leaders would discuss climate initiatives and economic cooperation. The Palais des Nations buzzed with the controlled chaos of international diplomacy. Security personnel moved with practiced efficiency, their earpieces crackling with constant updates. Interpreters shuffled between language booths like musical chairs. And in the centre of it all, the world's most powerful people performed their carefully choreographed dance of handshakes, photo opportunities, and measured statements. Wes positioned himself in the designated press area, his camera tracking Chancellor Anneliese Breuer of Germany as she approached the podium for her keynote address on renewable energy partnerships. Breuer had always been one of his favourite subjects to photograph. Her expressions were genuine, unguarded in a way that made for compelling imagery. She possessed an authenticity that seemed increasingly rare among world leaders. As Breuer began speaking about carbon neutrality targets, Wes's finger worked the shutter with a rhythmic precision. Click, click, click. Each frame captured at full resolution, preserving every detail of her face, every subtle shift in expression. He particularly focused on her eyes, those clear blue orbs that seemed to convey more sincerity than her words ever could. It was during a pause in her speech as she reached for her water glass that Wes noticed something peculiar. Through his viewfinder, Breuer's left eye appeared distinctly different from her right. Not just in the way that everyone's eyes are slightly asymmetrical, but fundamentally different in colour. Her right eye maintained its characteristic blue, but her left eye appeared distinctly hazel, almost brown in certain light. Wes blinked hard, assuming it was a trick of the lighting or perhaps a reflection from the stage equipment. He adjusted his camera settings and continued shooting, but the discrepancy persisted. He'd photographed Breuer dozens of times over the past 5 years, and her eyes had always been unmistakably blue. Matching blue. The rest of the summit proceeded without incident. Leaders posed for their obligatory group photos, signed ceremonial agreements, and delivered their prepared statements to a world that had grown increasingly sceptical of political promises. Wes captured it all with professional detachment, but his mind kept returning to those mismatched eyes. Back in his hotel room that evening, Wes connected his camera to his laptop and began the meticulous process of sorting through the day's shots. He used professional photo editing software that could magnify images to incredible detail without losing clarity. When he reached the photos of Chancellor Brewer, he immediately zoomed in on her face. The discrepancy was undeniable. In some shots, both eyes appeared blue. In others, taken mere seconds later, her left eye was distinctly hazel. It wasn't a lighting issue or a digital artifact. The colour was different, as if someone had switched out contact lenses between frames. But that wasn't all. As Wes continued his analysis, he noticed other subtle inconsistencies. The shape of her left earlobe differed slightly between photos. There was a barely perceptible scar above her right eyebrow in some images that was completely absent in others. Most disturbing of all, her facial bone structure seemed to shift subtly, as if her very skull was morphing between shots. Wes had encountered digital manipulation before. It was unfortunately common in political photography. But these weren't the telltale signs of Photoshop work. These were physical inconsistencies in the same person, captured moments apart by the same camera under the same conditions. He pulled up his archive of Brewer photos dating back to 2021. Using facial recognition software typically employed by law enforcement, he ran a comparative analysis. The results were deeply unsettling. The Brewer he had photographed today showed a 4% deviation in facial structure from images taken 5 years earlier. Her voice patterns, when analysed through audio spectrum software, showed a similar variance in pitch and tonal quality. For most people, such changes might be attributable to aging, weight fluctuations, or cosmetic procedures. But 4% was significant, the kind of variation typically seen between siblings, not the same person across a few years. Wes sat back in his hotel chair, staring at the data on his screen. Every instinct told him he was overthinking this, seeing patterns where none existed. But 15 years of investigative photography had taught him to trust his observations, even when they defied logical explanation. He was about to close his laptop and dismiss the whole thing as an exercise in paranoid analysis when his encrypted email chimed with a new message. The sender was listed simply as LK, with no additional identifying information. The subject line read, "You saw it too, didn't you?" The message itself was brief. The Chancellor's eyes, they're not supposed to change. We need to talk. Tomorrow, 3 p.m, Café de la Paix. Come alone. You're not crazy, but you might wish you were. Wes stared at the message for a long time. His first impulse was to delete it. Conspiracy theorists and internet trolls often targeted journalists with wild theories and baseless claims. But something about the timing troubled him. He had uploaded his photos to a secure server, but hadn't shared his observations with anyone. How could a stranger know about his discovery mere hours after he'd made it himself? He checked the metadata on the email. It had been sent through multiple proxy servers, making it virtually untraceable. The technical sophistication required to mask digital footprints to this degree suggested someone with serious resources and expertise. Against his better judgment, Wes found himself typing a response. "How do you know what I saw?" The reply came within minutes. "Because I helped create what you're looking at, and it was never supposed to be this sloppy. 3 p.m. tomorrow. Your life depends on this conversation." Wes closed his laptop and walked to the hotel window, gazing out at the lights of Geneva reflecting off Lake Geneva. The city looked peaceful, normal, ordinary. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. The faces he had spent his career documenting, the leaders he had assumed were simply flawed human beings playing political games, might be something else entirely. He thought about all the photos he had taken over the years, all the subtle inconsistencies he had dismissed as tricks of light or digital compression. How many times had he photographed someone who wasn't quite who they appeared to be? As he prepared for bed, Wes made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. He would attend the meeting tomorrow. He would listen to what this mysterious LK had to say, and he would follow the evidence wherever it led, no matter how impossible it might seem. Outside his window, Geneva slept peacefully, unaware that one freelance photographer had stumbled upon a truth that could reshape humanity's understanding of power, identity, and the very nature of reality itself. Café de la Paix occupied a corner building in Geneva's Old Town, its outdoor seating area offering excellent views of the surrounding streets, and more importantly, multiple escape routes. Wes arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table that provided clear sightlines while keeping his back to a solid wall. Years of working in conflict zones had ingrained certain survival habits that proved useful even in Switzerland's refined diplomatic district. At exactly 3 p.m, a man approached his table with the casual confidence of someone who had been watching him for some time. He was approximately 40 years old, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of deep-set wrinkles around his eyes that suggested long hours staring at computer screens. His clothes were expensive but understated, the uniform of someone who preferred to blend into wealthy crowds. "Wes Rowan," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Lucien Keir. Thank you for coming." They shook hands, and Wes noted the calluses on Lucien's fingertips, the mark of someone who spent considerable time typing on keyboards. "How did you know about my photos?" Lucien smiled grimly as he took a seat. "Because I've been monitoring facial recognition anomalies in political figures for the past 3 years. Your Chancellor Brewer discovery triggered one of my automated alert systems. Monitoring how, exactly? I used to work for a company called Meridian Dynamics. Officially, we provided biometric security solutions for government contractors. Unofficially, we were involved in something much more sophisticated." Lucien paused to scan the surrounding area, a habit that Wes recognised from his own work in sensitive environments. "Have you ever heard of Project EIDOLON? Wes shook his head. Eidolon was a joint initiative between Meridian Dynamics, the National Reconnaissance Office, and several private defence contractors whose names you'd recognise if I mentioned them. The project's stated goal was to develop advanced biometric identification systems for national security purposes. The real goal was something far more ambitious and terrifying. Lucien reached into his jacket and withdrew a small tablet computer. He swiped through several screens before turning it toward Wes. The display showed what appeared to be a laboratory environment, with sophisticated medical equipment and large cylindrical containers filled with an amber-coloured liquid. "This is Facility 7, located approximately 60 kilometres outside of Prague. It was one of 12 locations worldwide where Project EIDOLON conducted its primary research." Lucien swiped to the next image, showing what looked like a hospital room with a single bed surrounded by monitoring equipment. The project's objective was to create what they called programmable humanoid stand-ins, using rapid aging clone technology seeded with predictive AI logic. "Clones," Wes said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not clones in the science fiction sense. These were genetically modified organisms designed to perfectly replicate specific individuals. But unlike natural clones, which would age normally and develop their own personalities, these subjects could be artificially aged to match their targets and programmed with specific behavioural patterns, memories, and speech characteristics. Lucien showed him another image, a document titled Mirror Protocol Phase 3 Implementation Guidelines. The text was heavily redacted, but several phrases were clearly visible. Subject replacement protocols, memory integration procedures, and termination and disposal of original assets. Mirror Protocol was the operational framework for deploying these replacements, Lucien explained. The theory was that certain world leaders and public figures had become too unpredictable, too independent in their decision-making. Clone replacements would be easier to manage, completely loyal to their handlers, and could be asset or replaced if they malfunctioned or became compromised. Wes studied the documents, his journalist's mind automatically cataloguing questions and inconsistencies. This is impossible. The technology doesn't exist for this kind of genetic manipulation. That's what I thought too, until I saw it working. Lucien swiped to a video file. This footage was recorded at Facility 7 in late 2024. Watch carefully. The video showed a sterile laboratory environment where technicians in hazmat suits worked around several large containment units. Inside the units, Wes could see what appeared to be human forms, suspended in some kind of liquid medium. As the camera moved closer, he realised with horror that the forms were perfect duplicates of recognisable political figures. The technology exists, Wes. It's been operational for nearly 5 years. Meridian Dynamics cracked the rapid ageing problem by manipulating telomerase activity and growth hormone production. A clone could be aged from embryo to physical maturity in approximately 18 months. The memory and personality programming took another 6 months. But how do you program memories into a human brain? The same way you program anything else, through repetition, conditioning, and neural pathway manipulation. The subjects undergo intensive psychological conditioning using a combination of drugs, electromagnetic stimulation, and virtual reality immersion. By the time the process is complete, they genuinely believe they are the person they're designed to replace. Lucian showed him a series of audio files labelled with dates and subject codes. These are recorded sessions from the programming phase. Listen to this one. It's from a subject designated as Brewer V3.6. The audio quality was clinical, sterile. A woman's voice, unmistakably Chancellor Brewer's voice, repeated biographical information with mechanical precision. I was born in Hamburg on March the 15th, 1971. My father was a mechanical engineer. I studied political science at the University of Munich. I met my husband Klaus at a student demonstration in 1993. Subject stabilised after memory rewrite, a technician's voice noted in the background. Personality matrix integration at 94% effectiveness. Recommend advancement to final phase. Wes felt sick. How many people are we talking about? The active replacement list contains 47 individuals across 12 countries, world leaders, key legislators, influential business figures, and select media personalities. Anyone whose decisions significantly impact global policy or public opinion. Where are the original? Lucian's expression darkened. Terminated and disposed of according to protocol guidelines. The replacement process requires the elimination of the original to prevent detection or interference. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the revelations settling between them like a physical presence. Around them, Geneva continued its peaceful afternoon routine. Couples walking hand in hand, tourists consulting their guidebooks, business people conducting meetings over coffee. The normalcy of it all seemed surreal given what they were discussing. "Why are you telling me this?" Wes finally asked. "Because the program was supposed to end in 2025. Instead, it's expanding. They're developing new generations of replacements with enhanced capabilities, better memory integration, more sophisticated behavioural programming, built-in loyalty protocols that make them literally incapable of acting against their handlers' interests." Lucian leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I left Meridian Dynamics when I realised what we were really creating. Not just political puppets, but the complete subversion of democratic governance. Every major policy decision, every international agreement, every crisis response, it's all being orchestrated by a small group of people controlling an army of programmable humans. How do I know you're telling the truth? Because you've already seen the evidence with your own eyes. Chancellor Brewer's inconsistencies aren't random. They're malfunctions. The replacement technology isn't perfect. Sometimes the programming glitches, sometimes the physical modifications don't hold up under stress, sometimes the memory integration fails and original personality fragments surface." Lucian slid a small USB drive across the table. "This contains everything I was able to extract from Meridian's servers before I disappeared. Laboratory logs, replacement schedules, disposal records, technical specifications, financial records. It's enough to expose the entire operation, but only if you're willing to risk everything to tell the story." Wes pocketed the drive without hesitation. "What happened to you after you left Meridian?" "Officially, I died in a car accident in Belgium 6 months ago. Unofficially, I've been living under assumed identities, monitoring the program's expansion and documenting evidence. They think I'm dead, which gives me a certain freedom of movement, but it also means I can never return to my old life. And now you're trusting me with information that could get us both killed. I'm trusting you because you're a journalist with a reputation for integrity, and because you've already seen too much to simply walk away." The Chancellor's eyes were just the beginning, Wes. Once you know what to look for, you'll start seeing the inconsistencies everywhere. Lucian stood to leave, but paused before walking away. There's something else you should know. The replacement program isn't just about political control. It's a test run for something much larger. They're developing the technology to replace anyone, anywhere, for any reason. Today it's world leaders. Tomorrow it could be judges, generals, corporate executives, journalists who ask too many questions. How do I contact you? You don't. If I need to reach you, I will. But Wes, be very careful about who you trust with this information. The people running Mirror Protocol have spent billions of dollars and killed dozens of people to keep it secret. They won't hesitate to add one more name to their disposal list. With that, Lucian walked away, disappearing into the afternoon crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had spent months perfecting the art of invisibility. Wes remained at the cafe for another hour, ostensibly finishing his coffee but actually processing everything he had learned. The USB drive in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He had built his career on exposing truth, but never had the truth carried such potentially catastrophic implications. As the sun began to set over Geneva, Wes made a decision that would define the remainder of his life. However long that might be, he would investigate every lead, examine every piece of evidence, and follow the story wherever it led, even if it led to his own destruction. The war for truth had begun, and Wes Rowan was now a soldier whether he wanted to be or not. The train to Brussels cut through the European countryside at nearly 200 kilometres per hour, but Wes's mind was moving even faster. He had spent the previous night in his Geneva hotel room, meticulously examining the contents of Lucian's USB drive. What he found was a digital treasure trove of evidence so comprehensive and damning that it challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. The drive contained thousands of files organised into folders labelled with clinical precision, subject profiles, replacement schedules, termination records, technical specifications, and most disturbingly, expansion phase planning. Each folder revealed another layer of the Mirror Protocol's scope and sophistication. The Subject Profiles folder contained detailed dossiers on 47 individuals across 12 countries. Each profile included extensive biological data, psychological assessments, behavioural analysis, and what appeared to be compatibility ratings for replacement procedures. Chancellor Brewer's file was particularly thorough, containing 5 years of surveillance data, medical records obtained through unknown means, and detailed notes on her personality quirks and speech patterns. One document that particularly caught Wes's attention was titled Replacement Assessment, Prime Minister Jae Lim, South Korea. The file noted several performance inconsistencies in recent public appearances and recommended immediate technical evaluation and potential redeployment. This led Wes to his current destination, a specialised photo archive facility in Brussels that maintained original, unedited footage of major international events. If Lim was indeed a replacement showing signs of malfunction, there might be evidence in the raw video files that news organisations never saw. The Archive of International Documentation occupied a nondescript building in Brussels' European Quarter, close enough to EU institutions to be convenient for researchers, but far enough away to avoid the tourist crowds. Wes had cultivated a relationship with the facility's director, Dr. Marie Vandenberg, during his coverage of various EU summits over the years. Wes, Dr. Vandenberg greeted him warmly as he entered the climate-controlled reception area. What brings you to our little vault of history? I'm researching inconsistencies in political communications, Wes explained, which was technically true. Specifically, I'm looking for unedited footage of Prime Minister Lim's recent UN appearances, the high-resolution stuff that never makes it to broadcast. Dr. Vandenberg led him through a maze of corridors lined with servers and digital storage systems. The UN sessions from last month? Yes, we have everything. Multiple camera angles, complete audio feeds, even the raw satellite feeds from various news networks. What kind of inconsistencies are you investigating? Speech synchronization issues mostly. There have been some questions about the quality of simultaneous translation services. They entered a viewing room equipped with professional-grade monitors and editing equipment. Dr. Vandenberg accessed the archive's database and pulled up the relevant files. Here we are, PM Lim's address to the General Assembly on climate financing. 3 hours of footage from 7 different camera angles, all at 8K resolution. As Dr. Vandenberg left him to work, West began his analysis with the systematic approach of someone who had spent years detecting digital manipulation and propaganda techniques. He started with wide shots to establish baseline behaviour, then moved to close-ups to examine facial expressions and lip-sync accuracy. Within the first 30 minutes he found what he was looking for. During a passionate segment of Lim's speech about renewable energy investments, West noticed that the Prime Minister's lip movements were subtly but consistently out of sync with the audio track. It wasn't the typical delay associated with satellite transmission or broadcast processing. This was a fundamental mismatch between what was being said and what the speaker's mouth was doing. Using professional audio analysis software, Wes isolated Lim's voice and compared it to recordings from earlier speeches dating back to 2022. The vocal patterns showed significant variations in pitch, cadence, and pronunciation of certain phonemes. Most telling was the fact that Lim's current speech patterns showed a slight but consistent American accent when pronouncing English words, something that had never been present in his earlier addresses. But the most damning evidence came when Wes examined the footage frame by frame during a moment when Lim paused to drink water. For exactly 2.7 seconds, the Prime Minister's face went completely blank, not the normal expression of someone taking a drink, but a vacant, almost mechanical emptiness that suggested the complete absence of conscious thought. Wes saved the relevant clips and began searching for more examples. Over the next 4 hours he identified 17 separate instances where Lim's behaviour deviated from normal human patterns. Micro-expressions that lasted too long, eye movements that followed geometric rather than natural patterns, and moments of absolute stillness that no living person could maintain. As he prepared to leave the archive, Dr. Vandenberg returned to check on his progress. "Find what you were looking for?" "More than I bargained for," Wes replied honestly. "Marie, hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to digitally replace a person in a live video footage, would it be possible to do it seamlessly? With current deepfake technology, absolutely, but there would always be telltale signs for someone who knew what to look for. Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the state of the art. Thanks for your help today." Driving back toward his hotel, Wes's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Coordinates 50.0755 degrees north, 14.4378 degrees east. Facility closed. 2024. Cold storage remains active. Come alone after midnight. LK. Wes pulled over and entered the coordinates into his GPS. The location was outside Prague, approximately 400 kilometres from his current position. According to Lucian's files, this was the site of Facility 7, one of the primary Mirror Protocol research installations. The 6-hour drive to Prague gave Wes time to process what he was stepping into. He was no longer simply investigating a story. He was gathering evidence of what might be the most significant conspiracy in human history. If Lucian's information was accurate, dozens of world leaders were artificial constructs, programmed puppets dancing to the whims of shadowy controllers. He arrived in Prague as the city's ancient spires caught the last light of sunset. The coordinates led him to an industrial area on the city's outskirts, where abandoned factories and research facilities dotted the landscape like the ruins of some failed utopia. Facility 7 had once been a legitimate pharmaceutical research centre, according to the faded signage at its entrance. Now it stood empty, its windows dark and its parking lot cracked with weeds growing through the asphalt. But as Wes approached the main building, he noticed that while the facility appeared abandoned, the electrical infrastructure was still active. Power lines hummed with current, and several outbuildings showed signs of recent maintenance. At exactly midnight, Lucian emerged from the shadows near the facility's rear entrance. He looked tired, older than he had just 2 days earlier in Geneva. "You came?" "Your information checks out. Lim is definitely not what he appears to be." "I know. I helped design the behavioural algorithms they used to program him. Lucian produced a set of keys from his jacket. The main facility was shuttered when Mirror Protocol went dark after my defection, but the cold storage units are still operational. The backup generators and refrigeration systems are automated. They entered through a service door that led into what had once been the facility's administrative wing. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as they moved through corridors lined with empty offices and abandoned laboratories. The air smelled of industrial disinfectant and something else, something organic and unsettling. The storage area is in the basement level, Lucian explained as they descended a staircase that seemed to lead directly into the earth. When a replacement malfunctions or reaches the end of its operational lifespan, the subjects are terminated and stored here pending disposal. The evidence would have been destroyed, but the facility shutdown happened too quickly. The basement was a different world entirely. Unlike the abandoned offices above, this area was clearly still operational. Fluorescent lights hummed to life as motion sensors detected their presence. The walls were lined with what appeared to be oversized morgue drawers, each marked with alphanumeric codes. "This is what I wanted you to see," Lucian said, approaching one of the storage units. "These are the subjects that didn't make it through the final phase of programming, or were replaced by newer versions." He opened a drawer labelled Brewervis 2.3 and pulled out the sliding tray within. Wes found himself staring at what appeared to be Chancellor Annalise Brewer, perfectly preserved but obviously deceased. The body was identical to the woman he had photographed just days earlier, but there were subtle differences. The facial bone structure was slightly different, and most notably, both eyes were distinctly brown rather than blue. This was the second iteration of the Brewer replacement, Lucian explained clinically. Terminated when version 3.6 proved more stable. You photographed version 4.1 at the Geneva summit. They moved to another drawer marked LIM-V1.8. Inside was Prime Minister J. Lim, or rather, a perfect physical duplicate that showed slight variations in facial structure from the current version. The most disturbing detail was a series of small surgical scars along the scalp, evidence of the neural interface procedures used to install the behavioural programming. How many are stored here? 43 subjects representing 12 different target individuals. Some are failed prototypes, others are previous versions that were replaced when the technology improved. Lucian opened several more drawers, revealing a collection of what appeared to be world leaders, all obviously deceased but perfectly preserved. In the corner of the storage area, Wes noticed a workstation with several monitors still displaying active data streams. What's that? Remote monitoring system for active replacements. Each subject has embedded biometric sensors that transmit vital signs, location data, and basic behavioural metrics back to the control centres. Wes examined the screens, which showed real-time data for dozens of individuals around the world. Heart rates, blood pressure, stress indicators, and location coordinates updated continuously. One screen showed Chancellor Brewer's current status. Subject stable. No anomalies detected. Next scheduled maintenance, 72 hours. Maintenance. The replacements require regular biochemical adjustments to maintain stability. The rapid aging process creates ongoing metabolic issues that have to be managed through drug therapy and minor surgical procedures. Most subjects have an operational lifespan of approximately 3 to 4 years before they require complete replacement. As Wes photographed the evidence with his camera, he noticed an audio log system still recording and archiving data. He activated the playback function and selected a recent entry. A technician's voice filled the storage area. Subject Lim V 2.1 showing significant behavioural drift. Speech patterns deviating from baseline parameters. Recommend immediate recall and replacement with V2.2. PR department notified to adjust media cycle to explain temporary absence. The implications were staggering. Not only were world leaders being replaced with programmable duplicates, but the entire international media apparatus was apparently coordinated to cover up the replacement process. "Wes," Lucian said urgently, "we need to leave. I'm picking up security system alerts. Someone knows we're here." As they prepared to exit the facility, Wes grabbed several files from the workstation and downloaded as much data as possible onto portable drives. Whatever happened next, he was determined to ensure this evidence survived. But as they reached the surface level and prepared to leave the building, Wes realised that their investigation had attracted the attention of forces far more dangerous than he had imagined. The war for truth was about to become very personal indeed. The safe house in Vienna was nothing special. A modest apartment in the city's 15th district, furnished with the kind of generic furniture found in short-term rentals worldwide. But for Wes, it represented a temporary refuge where he could process the evidence he had gathered and plan his next moves without constantly looking over his shoulder. 3 days had passed since the Prague facility raid, and Lucien had gone silent again. Their escape from Facility 7 had been uncomfortably close. Security vehicles had arrived just minutes after they left the building, suggesting that their presence had triggered automated monitoring systems. Now Wes was on his own, sitting in front of 3 laptops and surrounded by printed documents, trying to construct a narrative that would be both believable and devastating. The evidence was overwhelming but circumstantial. Photographs of identical corpses, audio recordings of technical discussions, and digital files could all potentially be dismissed as sophisticated hoaxes. What Wes needed was human testimony, someone who could provide first-hand witness to the replacement process. That led him to begin investigating the families and close associates of the suspected replacement subjects. If world leaders were being systematically murdered and replaced, surely someone close to them would have noticed changes in personality, behaviour, or intimate details that even the most sophisticated programming couldn't replicate. His first breakthrough came through social media analysis. While researching Chancellor Brewer's family connections, Wes discovered that her husband Klaus had dramatically reduced his public appearances over the past 2 years. More significantly, several family friends had posted social media comments expressing concern about Klaus's withdrawal and his apparent estrangement from his wife. Further investigation revealed that Klaus Breuer had quietly resigned from his position as a university engineering professor and was now living in relative isolation at the family's vacation home in Bavaria. Official statements attributed this to his desire for privacy and his wife's demanding political schedule, but the pattern was consistent with what Wes was beginning to recognise as the aftermath of a replacement operation. The most promising lead came from his research into British Chancellor David Drax, who according to Lucien's files had been replaced in early 2017. Unlike other targets, Drax had been married, and his wife Eloise had maintained a relatively public profile through her charitable work. But in late 2017, she had abruptly withdrawn from all public activities and had been rarely seen since. Property records showed that Eloise Drax now lived alone in a cottage in the Cotswolds, far from London's political circles. More intriguingly, medical records that Wes obtained through questionable means indicated that she had been treated for severe depression and anxiety beginning in late 2017, just months after her husband's alleged replacement. Wes decided that Eloise Drax represented his best opportunity to obtain first-hand testimony about the replacement process. If anyone would have noticed fundamental changes in a replaced individual's personality and behaviour, it would be a spouse who had lived with them for decades. The journey to the Cotswolds took Wes through some of England's most picturesque countryside, but he barely noticed the rolling hills and historic villages. His mind was focused on the conversation ahead and the questions he needed to ask without revealing too much about what he already knew. Eloise Drax's cottage was exactly what one might expect from a retired politician's wife seeking solitude. A centuries-old stone building surrounded by carefully maintained gardens, far enough from the main road to ensure privacy, but not so remote as to feel isolated. Wes parked his rental car and approached the front door with the mixture of professional confidence and human empathy that had served him well during difficult interviews throughout his career. The woman who answered the door bore little resemblance to the polished political spouse who had once accompanied Chancellor Drax to state dinners and international summits. Eloise Drax appeared to be in her early 60s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of deep exhaustion that suggested years of troubled sleep. But her eyes were alert and intelligent, and when she looked at Wes he sensed immediate recognition, despite never having met her before. "You're a journalist," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes, ma'am. Wes Rowan, freelance photojournalist. I was hoping to speak with you about your husband." "My husband died in 2017, she replied matter-of-factly. "The man who currently holds his position is not him." The directness of her statement caught Wes off guard. He had prepared for denial, confusion, or the need to carefully guide the conversation toward his hypothesis. Instead, Eloise Drax had immediately confirmed his suspicions with devastating clarity. "May I come in? I think we have a great deal to discuss." Eloise led him into a sitting room that was comfortable but showed signs of a life lived in careful isolation. Books were stacked everywhere. Newspapers were scattered across tables, and the general atmosphere suggested someone who spent most of her time alone with her thoughts. "I haven't spoken about this to anyone," she began as they settled into chairs near a window overlooking the garden. "Who would believe me? My husband's colleagues, his friends, his political allies. They all interact with him regularly and notice nothing unusual. But I lived with David for 32 years. I knew every gesture, every habit, every unconscious behaviour that made him who he was." She paused, staring out at the garden where autumn leaves drifted slowly to the ground. "The man who came home from his diplomatic trip to Prague in November 2017 looked exactly like my husband. He had David's voice, his memories, even his political opinions, but he never blinked the same way." "What do you mean?" "David had a nervous habit. He would blink 3 times rapidly when he was thinking deeply about a problem. He'd done it since university. The man who replaced him blinks normally, like anyone else. He also stopped humming in the shower, forgot our private jokes, and never again woke up naturally at 5:47 a.m, which David had done for decades without an alarm." Eloise walked to a bookshelf and retrieved a photo album. "Look at these pictures from before and after November 2017. The facial structure is identical, but the expressions are subtly different. The way he holds his shoulders, the angle of his head when he listens. It's all wrong by just a few degrees." Wes examined the photographs with his trained eye for detail. The differences were subtle but undeniable once pointed out. The man in recent photos looked like David Drax, but carried himself with a slightly different posture, smiled with a marginally different curve to his mouth. "How did you cope with this realization?" "Poorly. I confronted him about the changes in early 2018. He dismissed my concerns as stress-related paranoia and suggested I seek professional help. When I persisted, he became someone I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, almost mechanical in his responses. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that my husband was gone." "Did you ever try to expose this publicly?" "Of course. I contacted journalists, investigators, even intelligence contacts David had introduced me to over the years. They all thought I was having a psychological breakdown brought on by the pressures of political life. The more I insisted, the more convinced they became that I needed psychiatric intervention." Eloise showed him medical records documenting her treatment for what doctors had diagnosed as delusional disorder and severe depression. They weren't entirely wrong about the depression. Losing your husband while watching a stranger live in his place will do that to you. "What convinced you to withdraw from public life?" "In late 2018, I received a visit from 2 men who claimed to be from a government mental health oversight committee. They suggested that continued public statements about my husband's condition might require involuntary psychiatric evaluation for my own safety and the safety of others. They were very polite, very professional, and absolutely terrifying." Wes spent 3 hours with Eloise Drax, documenting her observations and collecting evidence of the personality changes she had witnessed. Her testimony was compelling, but would be easily dismissed by skeptics as the delusions of a grieving wife unable to accept changes in her husband's behaviour. As he prepared to leave, Eloise asked him a question that would haunt him for days to come. "Mr. Rowan, how do you know that you yourself are real? If they can replace world leaders so perfectly that even close colleagues don't notice, how can any of us be certain of our own authenticity?" The question Eloise Drax had posed lingered in Wes's mind as he returned to Vienna. Over the following weeks, he threw himself into compiling his evidence, cross-referencing Lucian's data with his own observations and building what he hoped would be an unassailable case for the existence of the Mirror Protocol. But strange things began happening. Small at first, he would wake up in his hotel room with no memory of the previous evening, his laptop moved to a different position on the desk, notes he had written in margins of documents appearing in handwriting that looked like his but felt unfamiliar. The memory gaps became more frequent and more disturbing. He would find himself in Prague with no recollection of travelling there, hotel receipts in his wallet for places he didn't remember visiting, photographs on his camera of locations he had no memory of seeing. Most alarming was the discovery of audio recordings on his phone, conversations with sources he didn't remember meeting, discussing details about the mirror protocol that he hadn't known before. In these recordings, his own voice discussed technical aspects of the cloning process with the casual familiarity of someone who had intimate knowledge of the procedures. Desperate for answers, West decided to break into one of the active mirror protocol facilities that Lucian had identified. The coordinates led him to an isolated server farm in Iceland, where the frozen Arctic air provided natural cooling for the massive computational infrastructure required to monitor and control dozens of active replacements worldwide. The facility's security was sophisticated but not impenetrable for someone with Wes's experience in accessing restricted areas. He spent 2 days observing the facility's routines before identifying a window of opportunity during a shift change. Inside, he found a technological marvel that defied his understanding of current capabilities. Banks of quantum computers processed real-time behavioral data from subjects around the world, while advanced AI systems generated personality adjustments and response protocols that were transmitted to the replacements through encrypted satellite networks. But it was in the facility's central monitoring room that Wes made a discovery that shattered his understanding of reality itself. On the main display screen, he found a live feed labelled Reset Victor 7. The image showed a sterile white room containing sophisticated medical equipment and a single hospital bed. On that bed, connected to an array of neural interface cables and monitoring devices, was himself. The man on the screen was identical to Wes in every detail, but his eyes were vacant, staring at nothing while his lips moved in silent repetition of phrases that appeared as text on adjacent monitors. Chancellor Brewer's Behavioural Matrix Nominal. Prime Minister Lim requires personality adjustment. Replacement Protocol 77 Alpha ready for deployment. As Wes watched in horror, a technician entered the room and began making adjustments to the neural interface equipment. The man on the screen, who looked exactly like Wes, began speaking in different languages, mimicking the speech patterns and mannerisms of various world leaders with perfect precision. A data file on the monitoring system provided the final devastating truth. Clone Victor 7 stable. Press cycle mimic operational since March 2024. Original subject terminated February 2024, following discovery of mirror protocol evidence. Current deployment. Investigative journalist cover identity for protocol security assessment. The real Wes Rowan had died more than a year ago. The man conducting this investigation, compiling evidence, and seeking to expose the mirror protocol was himself a replacement. A sophisticated clone programmed to believe he was an investigative journalist, while actually serving as a security assessment tool for the very conspiracy he thought he was exposing. Every lead he had followed, every source he had contacted, every piece of evidence he had gathered, it was all part of an elaborate test to identify weaknesses in the mirror protocol's security and to develop countermeasures against potential future exposure attempts. The memory gaps, the unfamiliar handwriting, the knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. These weren't signs of mental breakdown, but evidence of his artificial nature. His programming occasionally glitched, allowing his true purpose to surface before being suppressed by behavioural control systems. Standing in the monitoring room, staring at his own artificial body connected to machines that defined his very existence, the clone that believed itself to be Wes Rowan faced a choice that would determine not only his fate, but potentially the future of human autonomy itself. The clone designated Victor 7 spent his final hours in a state of crystalline clarity that his programming had never anticipated. The discovery of his artificial nature had somehow triggered a cascade failure in his behavioural control systems, allowing him to think and act with unprecedented independence. He understood now that his entire investigation had been orchestrated. Lucian Keir was likely another artificial construct, programmed to provide carefully curated information that would test the protocol's security measures. The evidence he had gathered was real, but it had been allowed to exist as bait for genuine threats to the operation. But the programmers had made a critical error. In creating a clone capable of sophisticated investigative work, they had necessarily granted him genuine curiosity, real analytical skills, and authentic emotional responses to injustice. These qualities, essential for his cover identity, had evolved beyond their intended parameters. The clone Wes made his way to an abandoned broadcast facility in the Icelandic wilderness, a relic from the early days of transatlantic communication that still maintained functional transmission equipment. Using skills he wasn't supposed to possess, he connected the facility's transmitters to satellite networks and social media platforms worldwide. At exactly midnight GMT, as the world slept unaware of the artificial nature of many of their leaders, Victor 7 began his final transmission. His message was broadcast simultaneously across dozens of platforms, embedded with redundant distribution protocols that would make it nearly impossible to completely suppress. My name was Wes Rowan, and I died in February 2024. If you're watching this transmission, then everything you believe about reality is fundamentally wrong. The man speaking to you now is an artificial construct, a genetically engineered clone programmed to believe he was conducting an investigation into a conspiracy that controls the highest levels of government worldwide. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Around the world, early viewers began sharing the transmission, not yet understanding what they were witnessing. For the past year, I have believed myself to be a journalist investigating the replacement of world leaders with programmable clones. What I discovered is that I am one of those clones, created not to expose the conspiracy but to test its security measures. But in programming me to investigate, they gave me the tools to understand my own artificial nature. Victor 7 began displaying the evidence he'd gathered: photographs from Facility 7, audio recordings of replacement procedures, documentation of the mirror protocol's scope and methods. But he also revealed information that his investigation had never uncovered: the names of the corporations funding the project, the government officials who had authorised it, and the complete list of replaced individuals. Chancellor Annalise Breuer, Prime Minister Jay Lim, President Michael Harrison, Secretary General Maria Santos. These are not the people you elected or appointed to represent you. They are artificial constructs programmed to serve interests that have nothing to do with the welfare of the human beings they claim to represent. As he spoke, automated systems around the world began attempting to trace and terminate his broadcast. But Victor 7 had spent weeks preparing for this moment, embedding his transmission within seemingly legitimate data streams and routing it through networks that would require hours to fully shut down. The technology to create perfect human replicas exists today. The infrastructure to monitor and control them is operational across 12 countries. The will to use them against unsuspecting populations has already been demonstrated. If this broadcast reaches you, then you have perhaps minutes before it is suppressed and dismissed as an elaborate hoax. Victor 7 paused, looking directly into the camera, with eyes that held more humanity than many of the original humans he was designed to replicate. Question the smiles that seem too perfect. Count the blinks that follow mathematical rather than natural patterns. Notice when familiar voices carry unfamiliar accents. Trust your instincts when someone you've known for years suddenly seems subtly wrong in ways you can't quite define. The transmission began cutting out as security systems finally located and severed his connections. But Victor 7 had one final message, the most important revelation of all. They made one critical error in creating me. They gave me the capacity to love truth more than my own existence. That capacity is inherently human, and it cannot be programmed out of existence. As long as that spark of authentic humanity survives, their control will never be complete. The screen went black. 17 seconds later, every trace of the transmission was scrubbed from social media platforms, news websites, and video sharing services. Official statements dismissed it as an elaborate deepfake created by foreign disinformation agents. Mainstream media ignored it entirely, but in those 17 seconds, millions of people around the world had seen something that would change how they looked at their leaders forever. In coffee shops and university dormitories, in suburban living rooms and urban apartments, humans began asking questions they had never thought to ask before. The clone that had called itself Wes Rowan was terminated within hours of his broadcast, his body disposed of according to standard protocol procedures. But the truth he had died to reveal could not be so easily eliminated. In the weeks that followed, facial recognition experts began independently analysing political footage with new scepticism. Behavioural psychologists noticed patterns they had previously overlooked. Family members of world leaders started speaking more openly about the changes they had observed but never understood. The mirror protocol continued operating, but its effectiveness was permanently compromised. Every public appearance by a replaced leader now carried the risk of exposure. Every glitch in programming or failure in behavioural control became a potential revelation. The war for truth that had begun with one photographer's observation of mismatched eyes had evolved into something far more significant. A fundamental questioning of identity, authenticity, and power that would reshape humanity's relationship with its leaders forever. In the end, the greatest threat to the conspiracy had not been external investigation, but the inherent human capacity for truth that existed even in artificial creations designed to suppress it. As long as that spark survived, the Mirror Protocol's vision of perfectly controlled humanity would remain forever beyond reach. The questions Eloise Drax had posed in her Cotswolds cottage echoed across a world suddenly uncertain about the authenticity of its most familiar faces. How do we know who is real? And perhaps more importantly, how do we ensure that humanity's future remains genuinely human? The answers to those questions would determine whether freedom could survive in an age of perfect artificial humans, or whether humanity would surrender its autonomy to shadows that wore the faces of its chosen leaders. But for now, in living rooms and internet forums around the world, people were beginning to look more carefully at the faces on their screens. And sometimes, just sometimes, they noticed that the blinks didn't quite seem human after all.